Why don't you start by like tell me a little bit about yourself personally, and I guess a little bit about your history, but also how you got interested in the subject of energy in general.
So I'll just start by introducing myself. So my name's Sam. I'm from the Caribbean. It's actually a little island. It's called Curacao. It's one of the Dutch Antilles. Um, so it's just above Venezuela.
Okay.
So if I have to describe myself, I'd say I'm a researcher, and I'm a teacher as well. I teach yoga, scuba diving, and photography.
Cool.
And when it comes to my how I got interested in energy free or just energy in general, I'd
Mhm.
say my biggest inspiration has to be in nature.
Mm.
So just from being out in nature and trying to understand the mechanisms behind like biological organisms, or even weather systems, or just anything that can be that can be described as natural.
Mhm.
I'd say that's where I draw my biggest inspiration is
Mhm.
from studying or trying to understand nature.
Right.
Yeah.
So what led you to, I guess, the ideas of free energy in general? And just to
So
clarify, I guess I like,
yeah.
just for anybody who might be listening, we're going to be talking about energy in general, but like the main thing that got us talking in the first place was that I expressed an interest in free energy, meaning basically an energy system that is self-perpetuating. Like you don't need to destroy or burn or
Yes.
consume anything in
Yeah.
order to produce this energy. It comes
Yeah.
from like basically mastering the laws of nature themselves.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
why don't
Yeah.
you tell me how you got into that?
So I'd say I started getting interested in the concept of free energy probably around in like 2015 or so,
Hmm.
2015. Yeah, probably like 5 years ago. And I used to think of it more as something that is too complicated for me to understand. So I'd be like, I would have the mentality where I tell myself, oh, I don't have a background in physics, or I don't
Right.
have a background in engineering, so I'm not really going to understand. Basically, it was what my mind was doing to dissuade me from wanting to
Mm.
look into it further.
Yeah.
Um, but then, and actually, the past few months, sort of see this parallel with me wanting to just awaken spiritually as well. I see
Hmm.
a parallel with that to being able to understand these concepts. And
Hmm.
and another thing I'd like to add is that the more I looked into it in the past few months, the more simple I'm actually realizing it is. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? So,
Oh,
so you know
100%.
how a lot of things could seem complicated from the outside, but then once you start looking into something, you realize like, oh, whoa, it can't be that simple,
I
you
know,
know?
right? Yeah, I had a
So
very similar realization.
yeah,
And I kind of went
yeah,
through the same thing as you. Like there was a time where, I looked at very complex subjects such as like physics and stuff like that and just thought,
yeah,
I'll never be able to understand that unless I go to school for 10 years or something like that.
yeah,
And even
yeah.
then
I
I
think
didn't think I was
yeah,
capable. But
yeah,
I
for sure.
basically I started to challenge that because when I started to understand, like I looked within and found a lot of answers for my own life and for my own experience. So I was like, what can I understand? And when I started to explore that question, I started to read books that I thought were out of my league. And one of them was A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. I just thought, I'm going to try to understand this. And I read it and I got it and it made sense to me. And I was just like, I didn't think I'd ever understand what E equals MC
Yeah,
squared actually means or anything
yeah,
like that. So
yeah,
that kind of opened those doors as well. It's like, what else can I understand? So then when I started asking these questions, I started basically developing my own theories as to what energy truly is and what the universe really is. And the more I researched it, it seemed like a lot of my theories were pretty accurate.
yeah. Yeah, I'd say my experience was quite similar. I had pretty much those same kinds of realizations where you 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 look into something, and it's sort of like your inner knowledge is being confirmed in a
Mm,
way, you know, where it's like something you would have realized just from through, you could call it instinct or intuition, or
right.
some would even call it discernment, where
Mm,
discernment and defined in the dictionary is the ability to judge well. But I feel like, especially because of studying etymology the past year or so, I've noticed that a lot of words just seem very limiting when you look at their definitions, if
mm-hmm.
that makes sense. So even when you look at the root words, you can see how certain words were chosen deliberately. When you look at like the Latin roots or the Middle Dutch roots or the
Right.
Germanic roots,
Yeah.
you can see how it's almost as if the further back in time you go, the closer to truth those languages are, because you have one word that means like 30 phrases in English, in modern
Mm-hmm.
English, you know. So but yeah, so discernment, I'd probably define discernment as the ability to decipher between truth and lies,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
So, and at the end of the day, that could be the sort of inert ability that we all have instilled within us, but unfortunately it's dormant in most individuals, and that's because of things like societal conditioning
Mm-hmm.
and indoctrination. So but yeah, I'd say my experience is quite similar in terms of getting into free energy.
Mm-hmm. So you've been doing your own research on it, and what have you found? Like, what would you define energy or free energy as? Like, explain to someone who's never even heard of the concept of what free energy is.
So I would define the concept of free energy as tapping into an energy source that exists in nature, um, for it to be a perpetual system. It would have to be an abundant resource, right?
Mm-hmm.
So so basically something that we could consider infinite. And
Mm-hmm.
then when you look at different forms of energy, so there's thermal energy, right, like heat energy, and then you have kinetic energy, which is like by physical force,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Like
And then you
movement.
have things, yeah, exactly, and then you
Mm-hmm.
have things like solar. So solar is a form of energy which is relying on rays from an outside body. So
Mm-hmm.
that, so even gamma rays could be similar to solar rays, because
Mm-hmm.
essentially both are coming from above down below.
Right.
Whereas the only one that that strikes something in my mind that says that this could be the abundant energy source is electromagnetic energy, because it's the only one that I've been able to determine that it is actually abundant and it's always present. Our earth is always radiating this energy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it might be electromagnetic energy, and also in my recent research, so the past I'd say maybe the past few months, I've been sort of seeing um, a very like concise parallel between what physics would define as electromagnetic energy and ancient Eastern philosophies such as bioenergy or prana or um, chi.
Mm-hmm.
So you know how they talk about chi, right?
Right.
So, and I've been reading a few studies that they're actually scientific studies done by Western universities
Mm-hmm.
that have they've basically, the study is interested in the comparison between chi energy and the recent discovery of what they call bioelectricity.
Okay.
So bioelectricity is what they refer to as a form of electricity that every living biological organism radiates.
Mm, okay.
And it's actually something that can be measured now, which is why they're calling it a recent discovery, because it's like only now they can measure it, right?
Right. Right. But it's been
Um,
like theorized for centuries,
yeah,
if not
exactly.
millennia,
Yeah,
because now we have the
yeah,
machines to detect it.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so so yeah, and also when you start comparing all this work or this research to some of Einstein's theories,
Mm-hmm.
you start seeing how you can actually, I wouldn't go, well, yeah, I like to call things like they are, right? So essentially, in my recent findings, some of Einstein's theories are actually disprovable if these hypotheses are correct.
Okay.
Um, so for example, for example, E equals mc squared, right? He talks about how it's the theory of relativity where there's a difference between continuity and intensity, right? So basically, it's the idea that energy is equal to the difference between the intensity and continuity, right? And basically in physics, they define matter as continuity. So wait, sorry, it's breaking up. I
Hmm.
think my connection
I can
is
still hear you
a
fine. You're
little
just, your
my
screen is getting
connection
a
is
little
a bit
glitchy.
unstable. Oh, okay.
Should be
Yeah,
good now.
so physics defines matter as energy in continuity. So it's like energy that's reached a certain level of frequency for it to to continue existing in that form, right? That's why we have like solids or
Oh,
liquids
I
or
see. Okay. I'm starting to
um
understand now.
yeah. But then what E equals mc squared says is that it's also still separating the the two. So it's still separating the increase of intensity and the continuity. Whereas if you start realizing both as one, like they're both actually just one line, right? It's one line that increases on a graph and then eventually stays at like a plateau, or it could even be ever increasing. So
Okay.
it could be an ever increasing intensity. Um, and because it's ever increasing, it's continuous, right? That's where the continuity is.
Okay.
So so by realizing that energy is matter, it's no longer is it E equals mc squared. It becomes like E equals mc. So like energy is matter, matter is energy. One
Right.
can't be without the other.
Right. So it would
Um,
like, the way I've always kind of understand it is that like matter is just basically a conglomeration of energy, like a
exactly,
localization, a pocket of it.
exact,
It's in a
exactly,
certain
yeah,
spin, it's in a certain vibration, which creates
exactly,
the continuous nature of a piece of
yeah,
matter.
yeah,
So when you say the
exactly.
continuity, like it was hard for me to get it for a second, but I think I'm starting to understand. So when energy becomes so continuous in the sense that it's repeating the same pattern continually, that's what you would call like a particle of matter.
Yeah,
So it doesn't necessarily have to increase in intensity. Like if it remained in the same intensity over time, it would still be a particle
exactly.
of matter.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, 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 pretty much. And then when it comes to free energy in particular,
Hmm.
um, basically from a lot of from what I've found by digging into a lot of like ancient scriptures. So, for example, in particular, of Vedic scriptures, right?
Okay.
So texts dating back to as far as 8,000 BC, right?
Hmm.
Um, they talk about it actually it's a pretty like deep rabbit hole to be going into because it's a
Mm.
lot of information, and then you start making a lot of connections to our more recent history.
Hmm.
And then you start seeing how there's actually a lot of credibility to what these these ancients were trying to tell us. I mean, there's a reason why there was like an all-out effort to try and preserve these knowledge. That's not to say that all religious texts or all ancient texts should be taken as fact
Right.
completely, because over time even those works of literature can get contaminated by monarchs or by um, empires or just governmental bodies. They would
Right.
want to amend it in their favor, right? Like,
Yeah.
as the saying goes, the history books are always written by the winners of war,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
So but there is still a lot of truths in these works of these works of literature. So if you have a if you've been working on strengthening your discernment ability, it will be easier for you to be able to decipher between when you're looking at something that's truth, or whether it's something that's like been added in later
Hmm.
due to like self-interest. Um, so when you look at these ancient Vedic texts, a lot of them actually talk about not only the existence of electricity being used in that time period, but also that they had far advanced technologies to what we have today.
Hmm.
So their modes of harnessing electricity were far more advanced than ours. Um, in the sense that a lot of, so when you look at like a lot of these temple architectures, or even the pyramids, for example, um, you see how in most cases they were either topped at the very tip with gold or crystal, right, like quartz.
Hmm.
And then when you look at the electrical properties of quartz and crystal, they happen to be the most efficient conductors of electricity found in
Hmm.
nature.
Right.
So and when you look at a lot of these ancient Vedic texts, you even explicitly read words such as energy being relayed wirelessly via these structures. And I mean, if you compare it to Tesla's work, right? So, for example, the Tesla Tower, he was pretty much supposedly doing the same thing, where he was wirelessly relaying electricity via this contraption, right? This tower. Um, and that actually intrigued me into looking more into Tesla's work, because I saw the connection there and I was like, okay, so maybe there is a connection. And then when I started reading about Tesla's life story, he a lot of his inventions came about after his travels. And um, a lot of his travels was, or in particular, his travels to Egypt and India. And in India, he actually connected with like a spiritual guru, so to speak. And after that, a lot of Tesla's writings had very similar words to the Vedic text. So, for example, he would often describe energy as prana, or he would often describe the this atmosphere or this ether as akasha, and that's what they call the ether in these ancient philosophies, right?
Hmm.
So I saw a pretty interesting comparison there. So, and that's actually my main motivation, not only because of my ancestral heritage, but also just in terms of, because at the end of the day, the Vedas are all of our ancestors, right? It doesn't matter what like colors or
Hmm.
race or wherever we're from.
Right.
They hold our ancestral DNA,
Hmm.
and we hold their ancestral. It's like a vice versa thing. Where that's kind of the where the idea of that we're all one organism.
Right.
You could sort of look at Earth as one organism, and we're like just the cells, right?
Yeah.
And then a lot of like the dark stuff in our world today could just be explained biologically as a parasite infection.
Okay. Yeah. I see what you mean.
So yeah, so in my opinion, I think we are actually going through a detox right now, like
Mm.
a mother earthly detox, where just from me noticing that there's more truth surfacing, more is coming to the light. And I just feel like people in general are waking up to the fact that there has been an active effort in the suppression of knowledge,
Hmm. Yeah.
to create a power differential.
Hmm. I'm
Um,
curious. You say the Vedas, they're, I think you said from 8,000 BC.
yeah.
Are there any
So
other known scriptures that are older than that? Because like you were saying that they're all of our
yeah.
ancestors' knowledge. So is there anything that goes back before that?
So in terms of where I see the connection to other civilizations is actually after that, because
Hmm.
I think that it only makes sense that the farther back you try to go, the more difficult it's going to be, right? I think
Right.
that's a it's a given, because it just has more, the more time it's been in existence, the more of an opportunity it has to go missing, you
Right.
know, if that.
Hmm.
So so the connection to other civilizations is more after that 8,000 BC. So when you start looking at like 6,000 BC or 5,004 or even 3,000 BC, you start seeing how we had the the birth and thriving of the ancient Egyptian civilization,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then both, if you compare the two, so if you compare the ancient Egyptian civilization to the Vedic civilization,
Mm-hmm.
the Vedic texts talk about this sort of catastrophical event, which was like described of as earthquakes, or like global earthquakes,
Right.
and it basically initiated the destruction of their thriving golden age society,
Right.
and it forced them to relocate. So, and that's where you have the relocation from what is now considered what is now called India to what is today known as Egypt. There was this sort of migration from India towards Africa,
Okay.
and then when they established in ancient Egypt, that's where further infiltration took place, because the idea is that the catastrophical event was actually triggered by a breakaway civilization. So say, for example, you have this intelligent civilization, right? You could consider humans as an intelligent civilization, right?
Sure.
Um, and they're all working together, and they're all working as one, and they're living in this golden age society where they're using the most efficient forms of energy, where it's zero waste, and it's like the perfect world, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you have where you have the split is where maybe one part of that civilization wants to start studying something else,
Right.
so they would naturally maybe relocate, or just, you know how settlements, the natural movement of settlements is that they would just eventually keep spreading out,
Of
right?
course.
A
Yeah.
human settlement. So the idea is that um, after, like during this golden age, as you had one civilization starting to focus on one thing and the other focusing on staying in the golden age,
Mm-hmm.
basically the idea is that this other civilization got too deep into sciences such as nuclear fission and nuclear energy, so essentially trying to replicate the energy of the sun,
Okay.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So once you start talking about trying to replicate the energy of the sun, you're essentially, even if you don't take it in a religious context, you're trying to play God. Essentially, you're trying to play source energy, so that
Mm.
which created us, right? So even if you don't believe in God, you can at least agree that there's something. It doesn't have to be a living entity, but something else created us. It's
Mm-hmm.
what allows us to be living right now. Like the energy we're receiving to stay alive
Right.
is proof of this, whatever it is, a creative force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It could be a physical force. You know, it could be. That's my definition of God. My
Mm-hmm.
definition of God is this source of life and death. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
creation and destruction. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
It's
It's creation, preservation, and destruction.
right. It's the constant movement and change of energy in
Exactly.
general. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, what you said kind of sparked a question in my mind. Like I know what's accepted to be the general theory of where we came from. Like it said that all humans essentially started in Africa and then spanned
Yeah.
outwards. So at one
Yeah.
point we spanned out towards India, and then you said around that time, around 8,000 BC, is when
Yeah.
something happened in India that forced them to go back into Africa.
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea, I'll just bring up one of the points you just said about the cycle, right? So it's
Hmm.
like this it's almost as if it's this eternal cycle of creation and destruction.
Hmm.
So it's only natural, if you take that into consideration, it only makes sense that you would have this sort of thing repeating over and over itself. You know how they say history repeats itself,
Of
right?
course. Yeah.
So not only does it repeat itself in near term or short term, it also repeats itself over the course of 10,000 years or 20,000 years. Um, so the idea is that, oh wait, sorry, could you repeat what the question you asked
Yeah, I was
just
just
before?
wondering, what like if I was right in assuming that we started in Africa, but then we spanned
Yeah.
out
Oh
towards other
yeah.
countries such
Yeah.
as India, but then something happened
Yeah.
in
Yeah. Yeah.
India that forced us back into Egypt
Yeah.
and other parts of Africa.
Yeah. So the legend goes, or when you start looking at what these texts are depicting, is that this other civilization essentially was under the impression that they were still going to empower and enrich the entire planet even more. But it
Mm-hmm.
actually turned out to be catastrophical, which is what triggered the global um, earthquake. So not only did it destroy the Vedic civilization, but it also destroyed their own. So it was almost as if it was like this advancement reset,
Mm-hmm.
you could say. And when you look at Vedic texts, they always talk about like a 10,000 year golden age, and then the next 10,000 years is like descending into oblivion.
Right.
And then again, after that 10,000 year period, you're seeing it again being rebuilt. So it's like the rebuilding of the earth
Mm-hmm.
almost. And when I look at a lot of like eco projects of, especially today, like in the past few months or the past year or so, I've been noticing that a lot of eco-based projects have the capacity to reforest huge, huge areas of land. So
Mm-hmm.
it's almost as if we are heading into a, like the human species is heading into a condition where it literally has the capability to reverse all the destruction that's been done to our planet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what happened. This has happened before, so it's almost as if this rebuilding is what initiates the golden age, and then what causes the civilization to start adopting things like free energy, like electromagnetic levitation for transport.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're living in this perfect world, but then over the course of 10,000 years, it's human nature to forget as well, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what I meant by ancestral DNA, is that when you look at the modern study of genetics, there's probably like 70% of DNA that modern science still doesn't know what the function is, and they
Mm-hmm.
refer to it as junk DNA, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's almost as if it's actually this ancestral DNA that's dormant within us,
Right.
and the idea of awakening spiritually is actually just remembering and activating this ancestral DNA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a
uh,
very intriguing idea, man. And it
yeah.
makes a lot of sense to me too, because I've often thought that everything that was programmed into our DNA is accessible to us if we understand
Exactly.
how to
If
access it.
we exactly,
Mhm.
yeah. That's kind of what they also mean by or it's like a common phrase where people go, oh, we only use 10% of our brain
Right.
or 20% of our brain. That's
Yeah.
kind of, it's just an analogy for this,
Mm-hmm.
where we're not living to our true genetic potential, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've
But
also,
we're getting there. So
yeah, we're growing
yeah,
all the time, and
yeah, yeah,
I like the idea. What you're saying is like the cycle of going into the golden age and then kind of descending back into the dark ages.
yeah,
I'm curious if you know much about like the correlation between that and like the actual like. I'm not familiar. I can't remember all the terminology. It's been years since I've read it, but like the stuff like the precession of the equinox and like
yeah,
the actual rotation of the Earth on its axis. Every I think it's like 26,690 years or something like
yeah,
that. It goes through a certain cycle of
yeah.
um I don't know, spins,
So
I suppose.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So they talk about this in the Vedic texts as well,
Hmm.
where they refer to it as epochs.
Right.
So like one epoch is basically a full cosmic calendar year, which includes all cosmological events, right?
Hmm.
Because over a period of like 10,000 years or 20,000 years, you do see these recurring cycles and patterns in our cosmology. So in the what we can observe in space, there is these repeating patterns. And
Hmm.
then it's almost as if the most powerful days where we have the most Schumann resonance is one indicator,
Hmm.
are actually always aligned to cosmological alignments. So
Hmm.
when planets and constellations are aligning, um, it usually corresponds with a higher Earth uh, energy resonance.
Hmm.
And I think that's something we must look into, because I mean it's it's something that can't be ignored, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So
It's interesting because it's well known in science that
yeah,
that's what happens, but they don't,
yeah.
like,
It's they don't fully it's almost as if they don't fully understand it yet.
yeah, they don't.
Um,
Well, general academia just assumes that it doesn't have an effect on anything else.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
And that's where I feel, yeah, yeah.
the way
But
I've kinda always understood it is that, like we are talking about the Earth, like, to me, it's just like a top, like a spinning top, and every 26,000 years, it goes through a certain cycle of spin, and when it has like, a big wobble where it's all over the place, it's
yeah,
creating a lot of different frequencies and a lot of different waveform, but when
yeah,
after it comes to the peak, it moves so fast that
yeah,
it's not really all over the place anymore, it's kinda just, like,
yeah.
keeping a steady spin,
Exactly,
and that
exactly.
creates a more harmonious frequency,
Yeah,
which allows us to, like, basically connect to that harmonious frequency, which
yeah,
can raise the consciousness of the people on Earth. And I think
yeah,
that's, like, essentially what we're going into now. We're
yeah.
moving back into a golden age where there's a
Exactly.
more harmonious frequency.
Yeah,
The planet has a more fine, has less of a wobble. And in
yeah,
terms of our relation to the moon and to the sun, it has less of a dissonance between the two. So
yeah,
all of our alignment is becoming more harmonious. And
yeah,
that higher frequency, that more harmonious frequency allows us to tune into it and understand more and see more
yeah,
because there's less dissonance, there's less clashing of frequencies.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree with that. Um, I also wanted to point out that when it comes to modern academia, for example, actually, if we go back to what you said about the wobble of the Earth, right?
Hmm.
Um, a lot of the deeper I look into this, the more I start to see that there is actually less of a randomness component. So you know
Mm.
how modern academia or modern science, um, basically, in a lot of a lot of researchers' minds, they feel that randomness is reality,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So, and that's kind of where that's kind of the reason behind a lot of people's cognitive dissonance is because they start to believe that it's all coincidence,
Right.
right? Um, so when it comes to the Earth's wobble, I've noticed something when comparing it to observing the moon. I've noticed that the wobble is actually maybe something that we haven't, because we haven't been able to observe it or measure it yet. Um, we can't fully prove it. So at the end of the day, it's still a theory in the
Hmm.
sense that, for example, when I find it interesting how we're always seeing the same side of the moon, right?
Hmm.
So we're never seeing the other side. So we're not seeing the Earth. We're not seeing the moon rotate on its own axis as
Right.
well. It's like it's almost as if basically modern academia describes it as, or modern astrology describes it as, it's stuck in like this loop. It's like this loop where it's constantly facing each other, right?
Hmm.
So as the Earth rotates, it's always, I mean, as the they say as the moon rotates, it's constantly just, it's just naturally locked in where it's just constantly facing.
Right.
But then again, it makes me think, it's like, why is there no wobble to the moon? Why is there a wobble to the Earth but no wobble to the moon? Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Hmm.
So that's one thing that made me question the the idea that the Earth is wobbling on its axis as well.
Right.
um but yeah, when it comes to, I've noticed that when it comes to modern academia in general, the deeper I look into this stuff, it's like it's almost as if the more you're able to disprove a lot of a lot of modern scientific theory, like basically scientific theory that's taken as, that's kind of where the problem is with modern academia, is they started adopting theory as fact,
Hmm.
even though a lot of these haven't been fully proven yet. You know what I mean?
Right. Hmm.
Because we haven't technologically reached a point where we could even observe or measure these things.
Right.
um, so so yeah, I just feel like people in the scientific community need to be more open-minded in terms of not rejecting ideas instantly before even looking into something, because
Hmm.
that's an example of rigid skepticism, right? So there's a difference between uh, rigid skepticism and constructive skepticism, right?
Mm,
So because if you look at it, if you look at it as like a scale of cognizing or cognition, you could put like rigid skepticism on one end, and then gullibility and naivete on the other.
right.
um, but then when you strike a balance between the two, you're sort of in this balance between teacher and student, if that makes
Mm,
sense.
mm-hmm.
And that's actually where you're in the best position to learn, because
Yeah.
you're teaching what you know to be true, and you're still open to not only learning more, but also open to the idea that even some of the things you think are true could be
Mhm.
disproven.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas modern academia likes to stick to the rigid skeptical end of things,
Hmm.
where they feel like um, these theories don't have to be proven because they're coming from like an authoritative figure, for example,
Right.
or a lot of, I mean, you'll be surprised. A lot of times I'm even met with like ad hominem attacks.
Hmm. Yeah.
So where the yeah, so where you attack the character of the person making the argument rather than the subject of the argument that was
Yeah.
made.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that happens.
That seems to be
But
happening a lot
yeah,
these days because, well,
yeah,
a
that's
lot of
happening
truth
a
is
lot these
surfacing,
days. Yeah,
a lot
yeah,
of
yeah,
truth is surfacing, and people are
yeah,
reluctant to accept it because it means their whole
yeah.
worldview
It
is,
basically means their whole reality is shattered,
yeah,
right? So it's a
exactly.
hard, it's a hard pill to swallow.
Mhm. It is, yeah, and I get that
Um,
because it was the hardest pill for me to swallow.
yeah,
But when I
yeah.
did, it was the most beneficial pill.
Liberating. Yeah,
Yeah.
it actually, that's what I like telling people. I like telling people that it may seem doom and gloomy at first,
Mhm.
because it's sort of this realization that everything you've ever been told is a lie.
Yeah.
um but at the same time, it's equally liberating.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
equally liberating, in my opinion.
Yeah, because, well, for me, it's like you learn that, you have more control than you thought.
Exactly.
You know, when
At the end of
you
the day, yeah, that's true.
it's kinda like you learn that the
Yeah,
people that you thought were taking care of you aren't, but then you realize you have the
exactly.
power to take care of yourself and others, and
Ex-
you're not powerless, which is, and but then
yeah,
the idea of responsibility comes into play, and you realize how much responsibility you
yeah,
have when you
exactly.
realize that you're all powerful.
Yeah, and
So,
it sort of becomes like this loop where, with the responsibility and the power,
mhm,
because you start not only realizing that you're powerless, but that your power is actually the potential is infinite, right? So
mhm,
so your potential power is infinite.
yeah,
And that kind of goes hand in hand with responsibility, because as you keep increasing your power, and in terms of power, what my definition of power is cognition, like cognitive abilities, and like
mhm,
being able to understand, or being able to see truth, or even having more photographic memory, or you know what I mean, having stronger memory, or just cognition in general. So you could say a strengthening of the consciousness, right?
mm, mhm,
um, and when you start looking into that, you start seeing how the more powerful you become, the more responsible you realize you have to be with those powers. You know,
mhm.
so it's like this never-ending loop, almost like where you're
Yeah,
just constantly like expanding your awareness. You know,
exactly, and I
so
totally get the reluctance to accept that because, most of my life, I was just like, "I don't wanna do it, let somebody else do it who knows what they're doing because 'cause
yeah,
I'll mess it up."
yeah, yeah,
You know? But when you realize that you literally have the ability to create
the,
realities, it can get a
exactly,
little overwhelming sometimes, and
yeah,
you're like,
yeah,
"No, I don't want that responsibility."
yeah, yeah.
So, but
Yeah, I think it's in phases, right? Most individuals, they'll go through like a phase where they're maybe in denial for a little bit,
mm,
and then it sort of becomes easier for them to accept it, maybe if they're presented with that information again from like a more trusting source, or like a
right.
friend or a family, or and then they will be a little more receptive to it if they've already gone through that denial phase, you know.
Mhm. Right.
So I feel like every individual has the capacity to be able to expand their awareness and their consciousness.
Mhm.
um, it's just, it takes initiative, you
Yeah.
know.
You gotta want to.
um, yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So yeah.
I got a couple questions regarding some things you said earlier. Number one, when you talked about how there was like this split between, um, the civilization in India 8,000 years ago, you said there was like another civilization that formed that basically had different ideas. And
Yeah,
that's what essentially led to the catastrophe that created the earthquakes. Do you
yeah.
have an idea, or does it explain in the Vedas
So
how human activity in some way contributed to that?
so basically the idea is that it was what they refer to as the Atlanteans, right? And then when
Hmm.
you start looking at civilization myth, what they call mythological civilizations, but in my
Hmm.
opinion a lot of these were actually historical accounts.
Right.
So
Well,
there was, so at the same time there was another thriving civilization but in the Atlantic,
yeah.
right?
Hmm.
um, and the idea is that that civilization had the more scientific mind where they wanted to basically, it sort of goes hand in hand with this rigid skepticism where it almost feels like you need to control everything, right?
Yes. Right.
So so that's kind of where, that's kind of the direction that the civilization went in, where they not only felt that they wanted to control the sun but like recreate it.
Mm. Hmm.
um, and I think most would agree that at least most people with like at least a little, not I wouldn't I'm not to discredit or intelligence or anything, but I think most people would agree that trying to recreate a sun on the planet would be catastrophic.
Yeah,
So
sounds like it's got a lot of potential for
yeah,
a catastrophe. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So so the idea is that this civilization not only triggered a catastrophe for their own civilization, but every other civilization that
Hmm.
was existing in that time.
Hmm.
And it's sort of, it initiated the relocation as well. So you can see how the Atlanteans moved more towards Europe, right, to the
Hmm.
north, and then the Vedic civilization moved towards Africa in the opposite direction, to the point where Egypt was like this point where where this like the middle of this vortex took place,
Okay.
where
Right.
which is why you hear of the ancient Egyptian civilizations getting infiltrated, like starting out as being benevolent civilizations, but then
Hmm.
end up being civilizations that adopted slavery and
Right.
um, these kinds of practices, right?
Hmm.
So, so the idea is that the Egyptian civilization was more pure when they just got there than after it's been established, and then from foreign entities. So you hear of how the ancient Greeks invaded Egypt, and how eventually even the Romans invaded Egypt, and then even from the south there were invasions. So
Hmm.
so that basically a lot of infiltration was taking place. But the
Hmm.
correlation is where you start seeing how a lot of the gods' names are actually the same. Like, so when you look at in ancient Egypt, they call god Ra, right? So they worship the sun, this like source energy, and they call it Ra. And then in the Vedics called it Ram,
Right.
right? So they just add an M after.
Hmm.
And then a lot of the temples have the same names as well. So so a lot of the texts describe the building of the same temple. So there's only one temple that can be found today of that name, but it's found in both Egyptian scriptures and in Vedic scriptures. So you sort of see a very strong connection between the two.
Hmm.
Um, so so yeah.
I've always heard of the myth or the legend of Atlantis, but I never knew there was a connection between that and a civilization in India. But so
Yeah.
what you're saying basically is that it all started in India around 8,000 BC, but then there was like this split between some people there that didn't want to.
Well, not so much so that it started in 8,000 BC.
Mm.
So the split in civilization, basically, the idea is that the whole world was living in this golden age in harmony with each other.
Hmm.
But then over time, so this could be even way further before 8,000 BC, where
Okay.
over time, with a whole civilization being in a golden age, as humans start forgetting the dark age that preceded that golden
Hmm.
age. So for
Right.
example, what we're experiencing today could have possibly been very similar to uh, what happened preceding the last golden age.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's this sort of goes back to even before 8000 BC, where the idea is that over time, as humans forget their past, they start wanting to, basically they start forgetting that they're not the creators of themselves, right?
Mm.
So we've been bestowed with the gift of creation, which is where our power lies, and where our manifestation power lies is because, think about it, if we hold the gift of creation, that means we can literally create the reality around us, right? So it goes from realizing that you're blessed in the sense that something else external created you and bestowed the gift of creation upon you. But then it goes from that to forgetting that this external force exists, and thinking that we created ourselves, and trying to replicate that by things like replicating the sun, or even like merging with AI could be an example with this, in the sense that, for example, AI is actually a very interesting subject, because when you look at AI, you sort of see how when you're designing an AI, there's a difference between designing true intelligence and designing AI, right? So when you're designing AI, it's in its definition, it lacks free will, right? So you're designing it for a certain purpose,
Right.
and you're designing it for it to do certain actions and to calculate certain things. So that's kind of where you see it's almost as if you're creating a technology that embodies the epitome of logic and reasoning, right?
Right. The
But
rigid skepticism kind of movie.
exactly. um, and then basically you're creating a technology that's lacking it lacks the creativity and empathy aspect. So basically they say that our brains are split in two, right? We have the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere. And they say in brain anatomy, they say that the left hemisphere is in charge of things like logic, reasoning, and mathematics. And then the right hemisphere of brain is um, in control of the creation aspect. So creativity, empathy, compassion, emotion comes from the right.
Right. Intuition,
Yeah,
imagination.
intuition, exactly. So the idea is that if you have this sort of brain imbalance where you're too much on one side, so say for example you're too much on the logic and reasoning, that by nature means that you're lacking on the right hemisphere, right? So that can result in things like rigid skepticism. Whereas if you're too balanced on the right hemisphere side, you have empathy, you have creation, you have creativity, but you're lacking logic and reasoning, and being able to basically like math, right? Logic and reasoning. Your ability to understand reality is affected by you not having a strong left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere imbalance can result in rigid skepticism, whereas the right hemisphere imbalance can result in naivete or
Like blind
gullibility.
faith.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you sort of have to strike a balance between
Of
the
course.
two, and that's where you are not only learning the most, but understanding and like cognizing the most. So that's where your cognition abilities are strong, are the strongest. So but yeah, back to what was I saying before that? I forgot. Sorry, sometimes I lose my train of thought.
Yeah, the same way.
Yeah.
So much to speak about that you just take any tangent
Yeah.
and go forever on it.
Yeah,
I just
exactly. Yeah.
my original question was something that, like, I wanted to know more about the history of that
Oh yeah.
bifurcation.
So in terms of how it led to that catastrophical event, it sort of seems as though civilization was once living all in harmony with each other, but then they forget their history, and
Yeah.
then you have a civilization that starts focusing too much on logic, on the logic and reasoning side.
Right.
um, and that's automatically where you have a split in civilization, right? So you can
Right.
sort of look at split in civilization could even be just the founding of another country,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So, or where it's like another country that is adopting its own philosophy. Like, for example, in today's world, I look at like countries like China and other communist countries as a breakaway civilization, because it's almost as if the people living in these countries have accepted slavery, and
Mm.
they've just they've been like, okay, yeah, we know that our government is a communist regime, but we're okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the split I see in civilization today.
Mm-hmm.
um, you could sort of see a population that accepts slavery as a population that's too stuck on the right side and balance, right? Where
Yeah.
they would be too gullible, and they would have to accept this externalized power. They feel like they always have to, basically, like you said, blind faith, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's not only blind faith to religion, but it's also blind faith to the government, because at the end of the day, all of these are sort of boxes of consciousness, right?
Right.
So when you look at things like religion, when you look at things like government, or um, basically even like the financial system can be looked at as a box of consciousness in its current form. So
Mm-hmm.
so I'm talking, when I talk about financial system, I'm talking specifically about the fiat currency system, right? So where we have these governments that feel that they can print how much ever money they want to pay off their own debt at the expense of the taxpayer. So that in its by definition is an unsustainable system, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and then that's where I see when I see things like Bitcoin, for example, or the whole cryptocurrency movement. But in particular Bitcoin, I talk about Bitcoin more because that's the one I'm most familiar with, and also it's the first one that came into being, and it's
Mm-hmm.
by far the most, by far it's the most decentralized one I've ever studied, because it's the only one that has no like governing body or face, or like it's like it's almost as if it was something that was created by anons by for anons, you know, like
Right.
created by anonymous people for the anonymous, for the people, for we the people.
Right.
So um and when I see technologies like this, it gives me hope, because I see that people are realizing that the fiat system is broken, and that
Mm-hmm.
they can move towards a new financial system that it can't be controlled by a central authority. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So the supply of that currency is limited. There will never be more than it. It can never be replicated. It can only be devised. It can only be divided by more increments. So
Mm-hmm.
so that's how you could eventually scale it to mass adoption, where you just have to divide one Bitcoin by more and more decimals.
Okay. Could
Um,
you define what a fiat system is for me?
so fiat system is basically paper money. So fiat currency is the economic term for paper money.
Okay.
And you know how governments have these printing machines where
Mm-hmm.
they're literally printing like trillions of dollars
Mm-hmm.
at the expense of the reason why they're printing these trillions of dollars is because they have trillions of dollars of debt to pay.
Right.
But then it's like people don't realize that it's this unsustainable bubble that you're filling,
Mm.
where you're using you have this outstanding debt, but then you're incurring more debt to pay off the previous debt.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
And
that in itself would just keep inflating this bubble until it bursts. And when it
yeah.
bursts, it's the bursting basically just represents people realizing that it's a broken system, and
Right.
that's when it collapses, right?
Mm-hmm. I've learned about the monetary system that exists within the United States, but I honestly don't know if this applies to everywhere else. But the way I've learned that the Federal Reserve operates is that, if the government wants money, they will basically call up the Federal Reserve and say, we want some money, we want a couple $1 trillion.
Yeah.
And then the Federal Reserve gives them that money, but it gives them that money with interest. So if they said we want
Yeah.
$1 trillion, the Federal Reserve will give them $1 trillion, but they say every, month that it's
Yeah.
gone, you owe us another 100
Yeah.
million on top of that.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's inherently impossible to ever pay back the debt because the money that was printed doesn't come with the money that would pay back the debt. Like, where are you supposed to get the money to pay the debt?
Exactly.
So is that how
Exactly.
all uh, money systems operate around the world? Because I've
Yeah.
only learned that's the way it works in the United States, but I'm assuming that's for every global bank.
Yeah. So actually the Federal Reserve came into being, and if I'm not mistaken, in 1914.
Mm-hmm. It was around that time, yeah.
And before that, the standard, basically even after that, but before that, the major means of transacting trade, like from one party between parties, was gold, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they would use gold and silver and precious metals
Right.
as currency. And then we had the advent of paper money and bonds,
Mm-hmm.
which sort of started replacing gold as a means of exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the founding of the Federal Reserve, um, it was almost as if it amplified this paper money system,
Yeah.
but to the point where uh, basically when the transition from gold to paper happened, when each piece of paper could guarantee you a certain equivalent in gold, right? And
Right.
you
The
would
gold
actually be
standard.
able to go, yeah, the gold standard, and you would be able to go and retrieve a so and so amount of gold for the paper money you're giving.
Yeah.
Whereas in most cases in today's world, you can't retrieve the gold. So the banks that claim to the banks that have billions and billions of dollars in liquidity do not have, they're not able to redeem that equivalent of gold from the economy that bank exists in, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the country that the bank exists in. Basically, we're seeing um, this huge what do you call it, like a huge difference in the amount of paper money that's in circulation and
Mm-hmm.
the amount of gold reserves we have as a
Right.
planet, right? So
Discrepancy,
basically,
maybe? Is
when
that the word you're looking
so
for?
yeah, discrepancy,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So when the Federal Reserve was what came into being, it still abided by the gold standard
Mm-hmm.
until about, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was during the Nixon administration where he abolished the gold standard,
Okay.
and now no longer was the dollar backed by gold, but it was backed directly by the military industrial complex and the oil industry, right? So no longer did it become a, the dollar backed by gold, it became the petrodollar, right?
Mm.
Because the value of the dollar today lies in the agreement that all countries agree to trade oil in dollars,
Mm-hmm.
right? So once a country announces that it's going to start trading oil for gold, for example, that's when you see, or that's where we've seen, like, for example, what happened in Libya, for example. So Libya, if you look at Libya today, it's a completely ravaged, destroyed economy, and to the point where even like literally city-wide areas of land where there was once a city existing are just like rubble, right?
Mm.
So 1,000 years, or let's say like a thousand or 2,000 years from now, you will have archaeologists going to these modern cities of Libya and looking at them as ancient ruins.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So what happened to Libya was interesting, was because the the leader of the country, who was Gaddafi. You may have heard of
Yeah.
Gaddafi, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he was running. It was a socialist economy. He was running a welfare state, but to the point where the country's happiness and satisfaction levels were really high. So, for example, if you would get like a $40,000 grant for getting married as like a honeymoon grant, right? To
Okay.
go and like build a house for you and your wife, or so basically the people never felt that the government didn't care about them. In fact,
Mm,
they felt a strong sense of, okay, the government really cares about us,
right.
right? And the fact that they had abundant oil resources was why they could provide their citizens with this abundance. Um, so so basically, Gaddafi had started he started addressing the UN in a context where he was deciding that he was going to form the African Union, because he was like, okay, if you guys can do a free trade agreement with Europe, why can't we as Africa as well do a free trade agreement, right? So he was rallying all the African countries together to create the African Union, which in my opinion, I feel like unions don't work because that's just more centralization. But that's nothing to do with like what I'm trying to explain now.
Mm,
But anyway, so he was trying to form an African Union that comprised of the entire continent of Africa, where you would have free trade and like open travel, same like how you do with Europe, right?
hmm
Um, so, and also he wanted to start selling the oils, selling Libya's oil reserves for gold instead of the dollar.
hmm
And right around this time was when you had infiltration into Libya from NATO, from the military industrial complex, from basically collusion between Saudi Arabia and the EU and the UN and like the US, for
hmm
example, right? Because it's not to say that America is a bad country. It's just the people who were in charge of the country at that time were like self-interested
hmm
individuals, right? They were more service to self, so they didn't really care about stepping over people, or they didn't really care about how many lives would lose as long as how many lives would be lost
Right.
as long as they're making money, right?
hmm
um, at the end of the day, that's why war exists. It's because it profits of
Yeah.
certain individuals.
Yeah.
um, so he wanted to start selling oil for gold, and then that's when you had this, not only scrutiny from the parties that I mentioned, but they were also using things like Project Mockingbird, for example. Where, have you heard of Project Mockingbird?
Is that the one where like the news gets all the same
Yeah.
information? Yeah.
So it's an actual project that you can find. It's a CIA project that you can
hmm
actually find briefings and memos on,
Yeah.
that describes controlling the perception of the population of any given country and
Right.
using mainstream news as the vehicle to do so.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of time where you saw this all-out mainstream attack against Gaddafi, to the point where they were successful in convincing the Libyan population that their leader was evil,
hmm
and then it caused a civil war and an internal revolution,
Yeah.
and that's what it ended with, Gaddafi being killed by his own people, basically.
Yeah.
Um,
So he was at a point, like, if I'm understanding this correctly, like he had actually found a way to make socialism work in a sense. Like his people were like maybe not abundant, but they had more than enough that
yeah.
they needed,
So
and they were
so
happy
it's not,
people.
yeah. So it's not to say that socialism works per
Mm,
se, but he was able to sort of work within the system he was born into,
hmm
and kind of still, it was like his grand way of trying to provide his citizens with financial abundance by
Right.
staying within this military industrial complex, right?
hmm
Like this oil paradigm, this fossil fuel paradigm.
Right.
um, so yeah, in a sense, you could say he had one of the most successful welfare systems or
What do you mean by a
socialist
welfare
systems.
system? Because to
So
me,
welfare
growing up with the
system,
word welfare just always meant
yeah,
you can't work,
yeah,
so
yeah, I
they give
know,
you a little bit of pittance just so you can
yeah,
make it through the day.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But so my definition of, or at least the actual definition of welfare is just the more, basically the more of a welfare state a country is, the
hmm
more it's being controlled by the state. So for example, welfare could be defined as just aspects of life being controlled by the state. right?
Okay.
So aspects of life could be like the government controlling your food supply, your water supply, your education, your basically anything you would need to pay for if you're living this sort of formula of life, right? Where you
Hmm.
grow up and then you go to college and then you get married and then you
Right.
basically we're now starting to realize that not everyone has to follow this sort of at the end of the day, that's another form of what I talked about earlier, where I was talking about boxes of consciousness, where
Hmm.
people feel like their life has to go in a certain way because
Yeah.
of social standards.
Hmm.
Um, so,
So
so
even
yeah,
though Gaddafi's Libya had like they were kind of prospering in some way. It was prospering under the like through the system of what it's supposed to be. Like
yeah,
they said that this is how you want to live. You know, you grow up, you go to school, you get married, you get your house, you get all that.
yeah,
So he made that
yeah,
possible for everyone.
yeah. So it's almost as if you were to look at modern day society as an analogy, or if you look at, for example, the Matrix, right? Let's take the Matrix,
Hmm.
the movie, right?
Hmm.
It's sort of a good analogy to the world we're living in today, to this, in the sense that most people are living under this sort of illusion, right?
Yeah.
This illusion of free will choice. So it's like you're either a Republican or a Democrat, right? Where
Hmm.
there's no like, it's the illusion of free will choice.
Yeah.
Or even you could look at um, basically it's an illusion, right? So when you look at the Vedic text, for example, they often they refer to it as Maya,
Hmm.
and Maya simply means the illusion or matrix.
The veil.
Yeah. So
Hmm.
so it's almost as if if we take Gaddafi's example, it was almost as if he maybe wasn't even aware that he was living in this matrix. But
Right.
it's like, you know how you can like box someone up in their consciousness, but they can still be smart enough to work within that box.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's kind of what that means. It's like he was providing happiness and abundance for his people, but at the end of the day, it was still an illusion.
So then people started getting the idea like, what if I wanted to live differently? And
Yeah,
then I guess America and the West in general, with Project Mockingbird, basically
yeah,
encourage that idea. Like you
exactly.
may be happy, but you're not free. And then that
Yeah.
created the Civil War.
They did use, yeah, definitely. They used that in combination with character assassination, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it would be infiltrating the minds of that population, and
Hmm.
then also character assassinating the current governing body. So
Right.
basically painting them out to be, basically they would do, for example, there would be a lot of bombings and attacks,
Hmm.
but then on the news the people would be perceiving these attacks as retaliation from foreign countries because of something he triggered. You know what I
Mm.
mean?
Hmm.
Whereas it
Okay.
was actually the initiation of violence actually came from a foreign entity. Like it was other countries initiating violence in Libya, but the people perceived it as they were the like things like Project Mockingbird were successful in making them perceive these bombings and these attacks as a result
Something
of
Gaddafi
their
did.
own leaders' incompetence. Yeah,
Right. I
yeah.
see. So how did the West gain control over Libya's media?
So when it comes to mainstream media in general, right? So when you look at in the States, you have sources like um, CNN, Fox, ABC, NBC. But then when you start looking at other countries, so like for example in Canada, starts with a C if I'm not mistaken.
CBC.
CBC, yeah,
Mhm.
CBC, and then when you look at you have in Russia, you have RT, and then in what you would say is like the mainstream media of the Middle East is like Al Jazeera, for example.
Mhm.
Um, and then when you look at India, you have a lot of mainstream media companies here as well. But you sort of see the same narrative with no matter which country it's coming from.
Mhm.
So it's almost as if it started as a project within the States,
Right.
and they were able to learn from experimenting on their own population. and then eventually they were able to infiltrate simply through ownership, right? Because at the end of the day, when you look at the ownership of these media companies, they can always be like when you follow the asset management and the money trail, because when you start studying finance and like start looking at financial data, that's
Hmm.
kind of how you can sort of see what smart money is doing rather than what they're saying, right? So they can, oftentimes you have a media like a economist pundit or a huge billionaire come out and say something, but in reality they're doing the complete opposite with money, and oftentimes they're saying that thing to sort of trigger this movement in the market, right?
Hmm.
So by when you start studying when you start studying people's asset management, and then you start seeing where, not only where their donations are going, but also where the shares that they're currently holding, like 90% of like all media companies can be traced to the same six conglomerates, right?
Hmm.
So, and it would be as easy of just all of them coming to a room and deciding what needs to be the mainstream narrative.
Right. Okay. So the mainstream in the West is not limited to the West. They kind of have their tentacles
Exactly.
throughout the world.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
so basically, just to put it into simpler terms, um, there's powerful people with lots of money that basically make donations and give money and make deals with media companies all around the world. So it's not as if
Yeah.
uh, like Gaddafi never had control over his media, at least not completely. There was corporations that were coming into
Yeah.
Libya that were basically
Exactly.
buying the media and
Yeah.
buying what it says.
Exactly.
Mhm.
I mean, all it took, or even today, all it takes is being able to bribe an exec from a media company, right? So you would just need to present them with enough money to convince them to do your bidding,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Or to
exactly.
allow what you want to take place.
Hmm.
So, and when it comes, this kind of comes back to the suppression of knowledge. So, I mean, if you can agree that there is an active effort to suppress knowledge to create a power differential, it only makes sense that the ones suppressing the knowledge are the ones at the top of
Hmm.
this hierarchical structure, right?
Right.
So, so yeah, that's where you can kind of see a connection there, where oftentimes you are seeing a link between the suppression of knowledge and these like trillionaire cartels.
Hmm.
Oftentimes it's these trillionaires that have set up foundations and also are in charge of most education systems. So they're in
Hmm.
charge of curriculum as well, right? So
Right.
they will want to make sure that we only learn a certain amount. Or so, like for example, in history, right, when we take history class as an example, we should actually be looking at archaeological history as well, but we don't at all. We only, oftentimes the school will only teach, will not teach further back than like 500 years before that, or a
Mm.
thousand years before that, right? um, so so it's almost as if there's a deliberate, like in the curriculum there's been this deliberate system in place where they're like, they only want people to learn about recent history and not ancient history.
Mhm.
But then even ancient history can be clouded over time. So even when they do mention in ancient history, it can easily be contaminated
Right. Like you were
because
saying
it's like
earlier.
something they just touch up on. Yeah.
Yeah, like the example that you gave with Egypt earlier. Like the way we learned about Egypt in schools was that, slaves built the pyramids. They were all about
Yeah.
slavery. But as you
Exactly.
said, there was a time before that where they were a lot more harmonious and lived, in a lot more peaceful state. But
Exactly.
then interference from other places and just the introduction of, I guess, fear in general kind of moved them towards more of a, like you were saying earlier, like uh, a rigid state of mind where everything had to be
Yeah.
logical and it was all
Yeah.
about growth and
Yeah.
getting more and more and more, which
Yeah.
created that kind of power
Yeah.
divide.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So ideally it's trying to find a balance between logic and creativity,
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
how you're able to get the best results.
Hmm.
um, yeah.
So that's a good way to like kind of transition to what we were originally talking about is like, so what type of, hmm, I guess I just want to talk more about the different types of energy systems that we could be using right now, and the ways in which it has been suppressed. Because I've encountered that myself a lot. Um, kind of what you were saying earlier about how like once you open yourself, you put yourself in the middle of that spectrum where you're either a rigid skeptic or you're completely naive. I used to be somewhat of a rigid skeptic, where if I heard something uh,
Oh, sorry.
regarding
Yeah,
like
that's my phone.
I don't know, like the power of the mind or something like that, I would just kind of squash it out and be like, it's not provable by a scientific paper, so therefore
Yeah,
it's not real. But then I would basically dismiss anything that came to me that wasn't within my worldview. But then once I realized basically one thing didn't coincide with what I thought, I was like, well, what else doesn't make sense to me? So then I kind of opened that door, and I realized that like a lot of the things people say, even though a lot of the people that say these things may be viewed as crazy or are just stupid. Um, if you look
yeah,
deeply into a lot of different theories, you'll realize that there's some truth lying underneath all of that. So
yeah,
in terms of like
yeah,
what we what we know now and what we're coming to know and what we're learning more and more every day is that there is a big connection between quote science and spirituality. And you might even say
yeah,
that the spirit is not even magical the way we thought it was. It's just what don't we can't describe yet with science, but it
yeah,
can be described with science.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I honestly think it can be described as science. It's just we haven't, basically we haven't perceived this life energy yet to its fullest potential.
Hmm.
So so it's like, how can you explain something that you haven't experienced,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
So that's where I see this correlation, where I feel like we will eventually be able to more efficiently explain these concepts, as we become more spiritually evolved, because
Mm.
it's like it's kind of one of the same.
Yeah.
I feel like scientific development and the involvement of spirituality is is very linked. And you can even see this. Another thing you can notice with ancient civilizations is, for example, if they did have this technology, you can see how when you have a civilization that's not spiritually evolved, but then is all of a sudden in control of these kinds of technologies, how they can pretty much just destroy themselves,
Mm.
because they're not capable of using it the way it was designed to be
Right.
used.
Hmm.
They end up using it for the wrong reasons and end up being the reason for their own destruction.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, so that's why I feel like the concept of free energy is it's by definition a spiritual concept, because
Hmm.
you're talking about empowering the entire world, right, and every living being on that world. Because not only are you empowering the human species, but you're completely stopping all the destruction. Not only stopping all the destruction, but we're in fact reversing the damage.
Hmm.
So so it's almost as if it's the empowerment of the entire organism that is Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it seems to me like that's the direction we're going in, and I see
yeah,
it more and more. And just a little bit of research that I've done, like I've always kind of intuitively understood how it works, but just
yeah,
since you and I connected the other day, I did a little bit of digging last night, watching a bunch of different stuff and reading a bunch of different stuff about where we are with free energy. And like one of the questions I proposed to you 4 or 5 days ago when we spoke is like, how come we're not seeing it? Because like you hear about people that discuss like 0 point energy or something like that, but you don't really see the machines.
yeah,
You don't really see the
yeah,
scientists that are
yeah,
researching these things. But then when I just did a little
yeah,
bit digging, I found there are loads of scientists that have tried to do this
yeah,
before, but were suppressed. And one example that was really like, it's kind of like the poster child of like how this works is that there was a guy in I think the 80s, 70s or 80s, and there's actually news footage of this where he figured out
yeah,
how to run his car on water. And it's
Yeah,
become like a meme.
I've
It's
seen
become like
that.
a funny
Yeah,
thing, but it actually
yeah,
happened. There was a
it
guy who
actually
ran
happened.
his car
Yeah,
on water. And
yeah,
then I think he met with like two German investors or something like that. And he was having dinner with them. And they tried to either buy his technology. And then when he wouldn't agree, he was said to be seen running from the restaurant, uh, clutching his throat and basically saying, screaming, "They killed me, they poisoned me," and then he had a heart attack, and that was the last of him. So I haven't fact checked this. I don't know if that part is true,
yeah.
but the
Well,
fact that he could actually run a car on water is pretty
yeah,
mind blowing to me.
yeah. The thing is, even that second part does seem, I mean, from my level of discernment, it
Hmm.
does seem that something like that would be true because it happens so many times. Like
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
happened every time someone tries to come out with the truth, at least in our recent, let's say like the last century. I
Hmm.
mean, look what happened in the States. A president was assassinated for
Hmm.
wanting to speak the truth, right?
Right.
So when you look at the JFK assassination, that's another example of the suppression of knowledge, where this guy was trying to quote unquote uncover or lift the veil on certain things, right?
Hmm.
And after making those announcements, he's like, he gets assassinated, and then people wonder why. I mean,
Hmm.
it kind of becomes a point. It reaches a point where it becomes obvious,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, so yeah, in the case with this gentleman who created the hydro-powered car, um, I mean, it happens too often where you have an inventor who invents like this breakthrough technology, and they either give in to basically they'll give in by selling their technology. So if they're basically they're enticed, right? So they're met with like billions of dollars, and it's their less spiritually evolved state that pushes them to taking the money,
Mm.
even though they know it's probably just going to be shoved in a drawer and never invented.
Hmm.
That's kind of something they have to live with their entire life. And actually, a lot of times these investors, I mean, these inventors go into depression after doing that, because it's kind of like they have to live with this guilt their whole life. And if you look at guilt as an emotion, guilt is actually a natural human emotion. It's a psychological uh, it's a psychological emotion that takes place when your psychology wants to take revenge on your physiology, right?
Mm.
So it's like your psychology wants to take revenge on an action that you took.
Hmm.
um so in this case, they're living with the guilt that they sold out,
Right.
right? um and so they're actually met with two options most of the time when it comes to when they're approached by financiers. They're either enticed by the millions or billions and then they sell, or they refuse to sell and then they end up dead or missing or
Yeah.
character assassinated.
Hmm. Yeah.
um so but yeah, I think it's getting harder for parasitic behavior, because the thing is, when I describe behavior like that, so when I describe conspiracies or people conspiring to suppress knowledge or to suppress individuals or like humans or anything, right? Just
Hmm.
suppression. So like suppressing life. um I often describe it as parasitic behavior, because at the end of the day, remember when I gave the analogy of the earth being this biological organism?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's sort of like we just have to deal with this parasitic problem. And I feel like it's getting harder for them to do things like this. So it's getting
Hmm.
harder for them to silence inventors. It's getting harder for them to prevent truth from coming out, and to prevent suppressed knowledge from coming out, for the fact that we are becoming aware that we're infected by parasites as a biological being. So it's kind of like you as an individual, when you start throwing up all of a sudden and you feel sick, and then you find out that it's because of a parasitic infection. um, Oftentimes when it comes to biological organisms, that's also another interesting topic, given what's happening in the world today with COVID-19 and all the hysteria, right? So when you look at microorganisms, everyone likes to talk about virus and bacteria, but it's like no one likes to talk about parasites.
Mm.
And then when you look at bacteria, when you compare all three, you see how parasites are the only one where there's no like good or bad version of it. So for example, you know how we have a biome, a microbiome in our gut that contains like billions of beneficial bacteria that help in digesting our food and absorbing the nutrients for it to be able to be absorbed into our blood, and for it to be basically for it to be administered to our blood in a form that it can be of use by
Mm-hmm.
the blood, right? So, and not only do we have good bacteria, but we also have a virome in our body. So we even
Mm-hmm.
have good virus in our body, like viruses. But most people would think of the two as inherently something that can negatively affect you, which
Yeah.
is not true. Whereas the one that they don't like to talk to or know too much about is actually the one that inherently has negative effects, to the point where even when you compare the infection, so say you compare a bacterial infection, a bacterial and viral infection to a parasitic infection is the one that's more long term. So you don't realize you're infected by it until a certain period of time, until you actually start not only realizing that you're like you are throwing up and stuff, but you're also, it's like your psychological patterns are messed up. So most often people who are infected by parasites not only have like physiological symptoms, but they also have psychological symptoms, in the sense that they're stuck in a very bad pattern of junk food eating, drug use, synthetic drug use, um, alcohol, cigarettes, basically anything that
Mm-hmm.
can be considered a toxin, right?
Right.
Um, and oftentimes it's because this parasite that starts off infecting your digestive system eventually starts spreading throughout the body, to the point where it's even reproducing. It's literally reproducing in your brain,
Mm-hmm.
to the point where it's controlling your behaviors. So, so essentially the parasites are like a biological explanation for things like even like things like depression or anxiety, or being in like these being in a stuck being in a s- stuck being stuck in a cycle of unhealthy living
Mm-hmm.
patterns,
Yeah.
um, are more often than not due to a parasitic infection.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost as if we as a planet are going through this, where we're now becoming aware of the problem, and
Mm-hmm.
we're like starting to take the actions we need to be taking to like flush out all these parasites from our
Mm.
system.
Right. Because like
um,
beforehand, it was kind of like how when you have a parasite, like you said, it could lead to depression or other mental illness in general.
yeah,
But if you're not aware of the parasite, then you're just going to inherently believe there's something wrong with yourself.
exactly,
And that's the kind of way we're viewing the world right now. It's just like there's something
exactly,
wrong with the world. We just get viruses. It's just how it is.
yeah,
But it doesn't
exactly.
have to
people
be
people
that
often
way.
like to, yeah, they often like to blame it and say, oh, that's human nature.
Right.
And they
Yeah.
think that these evils are human nature, when
Hmm.
they're actually actions being caused by a parasite infected human.
Hmm. Exactly.
um, yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's where the distinction has to happen. But I think I just feel in general I have this, not only not only from speaking to people I know and my peers and my family, but
Hmm.
in general from what I've seen on the internet, and the fact that like I'm even doing this right now and connecting with you, for example, who is another like-minded individual, is a result of of the world just coming together and realizing that we are actually this one organism.
Hmm.
And the more we come together, it will automatically result in things that we're after. For example, you know how we spoke about spiritual involvement and
Hmm.
raising the consciousness, and like basically improving our cognitive abilities, right? That
Yeah.
could be like the scientific way to describe it. It's just in the improving of your consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
um and when you look at how us coming together can directly result in that, to the point where we are now synergistically, so basically it's like two minds are working as one now, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, and I've noticed that with my he's like, I consider him my best friend and business partner. And we're actually working on a project together in Thailand. And I just feel whenever we're working in the same space. The thing is, right now I'm in India and he's in Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I've just noticed that whenever we're actually in the same space working together, there's just this synergistic um, creativity happening, where we're constantly like not only bouncing ideas off each other and brainstorming, but it's sort of, it feels as if two minds are working as one to create a certain thing.
Yeah.
You know what I
I know
mean?
the feeling. Yeah.
So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's, I found that very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because
Yeah.
we are just all different, nodes of the same
Exactly.
intelligence, right?
Exactly. A good
Mhm.
analogy could be like that that it's this giant jigsaw puzzle,
Mm,
right? And we're all just like each individual pieces to this puzzle. But then once you start clicking the pieces together, it's like, that's where these synergies and synchronicities take place, and they're often perceived as coincidence. So
mhm.
so that's where the idea that coincidence is an illusion is
Right.
that oftentimes it's actually just a synergistic or synchronistic event happening,
Mhm.
which can be directly explained by the science of pattern recognition.
Mhm.
um, but it's perceived as coincidence, and that's
Right.
kind of where this rigid skepticism comes into play, is because oftentimes the rigid skepticism in the science in modern academia comes from them believing that it's all just a
Yeah.
coincidence, right?
Mhm. It's all
So
random.
yeah, basically it's that's where the flaw is thinking
Mhm.
that it's all random.
Yeah. To me, the idea of randomness is just it's like the area of which we cannot measure yet. It's like we
Yeah,
don't have the tools to measure it. We don't know how those
yeah,
numbers came to be. So
yeah,
therefore it must be random. But if we were to
exactly.
go deeper
Ex-
and look at it from different angles, we might be able to find out exactly what caused it.
yeah.
And a good example, and it might actually tie back to what something you mentioned earlier, but have you heard of like the instances of basically mass consciousness being demonstrated through random number generators?
Oh yeah.
So,
So
like, just an
yeah, yeah,
example,
yeah,
the one that
yeah. I
I
remember seeing that.
yeah, the most significant one that I remember is that, just for anybody who doesn't understand, there are random number generators all over the world, and they basically just generate random numbers. Like when you
Numbers,
track
yeah,
what they're doing, you have no idea why those numbers are coming up. It just gives
yeah,
you a random number every so many seconds or whatever.
yeah,
And there's ostensibly like apparently like there's no pattern behind it, but on certain days when the world's consciousness, I guess you could say, is more in line with each other, you'll start to notice patterns in those generators. And one
yes,
one of the most prime examples was on 9/11. I think it might even been before it, which is really interesting because it kind of gives you like this predictive power. But
yeah,
they were just all producing different random numbers that nobody could understand. And then on 9/11, or even slightly before it, like a day before, and then during, and then a little bit after, a lot of these random number generators started to sync up with each other. So
yeah.
there's something that's driving that randomness that we cannot
Exactly,
measure.
exactly.
So it
Yeah,
kind of
that's
just points towards
yeah,
that, global consciousness having an effect on the random or the coincidental.
exactly. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's yeah. You put it really well there. The idea of randomness is actually very interesting to me because, so for example, when you look at things like AI, right?
Mhm.
Remember how I mentioned earlier how AI could be the sort of creation that we're trying to create, but it's just only focused on the logic and reasoning and math aspect of it, where it's like there's no randomness component. Well, the thing is, that's where I find randomness interesting, is because the random component comes from the right side of the brain. So
Mm.
so the randomness component comes from the creativity and empathy, right? So this example of these random generators replicating consciousness could be an example of the creation of true intelligence in comparison to artificial intelligence, because now
Mm.
you're creating a form of intelligence that does have free will,
Mm-hmm.
um, to the point where, because it's generating what it wants, right? And
Right.
that's what makes it random. That's why we can't. So so in a way, that's where I think things like artificial intelligence are interesting, and where people have to understand the difference between artificial intelligence and creating what I call true intelligence. So it could be, for example, have you seen that movie, oh wait, it's breaking up a bit. Can you hear me
Yeah,
okay?
I still hear and see you fine.
Oh, okay, my connection is also, yeah, my feed. Okay. So have you seen that movie? It's called, I think it's called Alita Battle Angel.
I
Have you
don't think
seen
so.
it?
No. Mm-mm.
So it's an animated, it's like semi animated, semi live action,
Mm-hmm.
and it talks about, basically it's this like well-meaning scientist who creates a robot that can't be, like, you can't tell that it's a robot
Mm-hmm.
because of how human they are and how compassionate they are, because she's ends up being like the hero of the story that saves the world from the evil or
Okay.
whatever. So, and it's because she's been instilled with not only the logic and reasoning, but also the creativity and empathy. It's the empathy that's instilled within her that wants her to want to save the world and
Mm.
whatever. So so and that's where I think it's the idea of randomness is very important, is because um when you look at, for example, when you said how it aligned with 9/11, that's actually really interesting, because it's almost as if these events are, remember how we talked about this divine cycle of time, right? And everything we always we have golden ages, and then we have dark ages, and then it's this constant, like, same like the yin and yang, how they say it's like two fish, one's the black fish, one's the white fish, and they're
Mm-hmm.
constantly eating each other up. But
Right.
depending on what context you're looking at it, so say if you're only observing the white fish, which it could be uh, an analogy for light or goodness,
Mm-hmm.
right? um, if you're observing that being eaten by the blackfish, eventually it reaches a point where there's only one small speck of the white fish left, but that's the
Mm-hmm.
exact moment, that's the exact reversal point as well. So that's the exact point that it starts, it's that exact moment where the white fish begins eating the blackfish, and then it's
Okay, I
like,
see.
and then that's us ascending back into a golden age,
Mm.
you could say, right?
Mm-hmm.
So so when it comes to the random generators aligning on 9/11, for example, or like on a key event day, right? It's almost as if these events are supposed to take place because it's the natural order of things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's why no matter what the parasites in our world do now to try and prevent us from entering the golden age, like, no matter what they try, will fail, because essentially they're trying to go against natural law.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
That's where the whole
yeah,
idea of like the on the greater stage, the idea of like the wobble of the earth, like the precession of the equinox and stuff like that. Like the world is becoming more in line with the
exactly.
planet and itself and its own on its own axis. So just because there's people doing quote evil on this earth, they're not going to win because the 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 procession and the progression moving into a more harmonious frequency is inevitable. Now,
Yeah,
like the only way
exactly.
to stop that would be like to literally create a machine so big that you could go outside the earth and then hold it in place. You know what I
Exactly.
mean? Like
Or like
you
physically lock the planet with a
exactly.
cage. You know what
So
I mean?
as long as we can
Yeah.
prevent that,
Yeah.
then we'll be
Yeah.
fine because we'll
Yeah.
definitely move in. We are moving into
Yeah.
the golden age, and
Yeah.
uh, like you said, that parasitic type of mentality is trying to resist it. So there's going to be
Exactly.
a lot of resistance in general, and maybe a lot
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
calamity because of that.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's inevitable that we move into this
Yeah.
golden age.
Yeah. I feel like ultimately it's the diminishing of the parasites, or like the us getting rid of them,
Mm-hmm.
all it takes is us being aware of the problem. So as soon
Exactly.
as we're aware of the parasites, that's already in, by definition, an offensive action,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
They only operate
So
when we are in ignorance.
we're in ignorance. Exactly, they rely on our ignorance to operate. So
Exactly.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
This actually reminds me of something like the random number generator stuff. It reminded me of something that you mentioned earlier that I have a basic understanding of. I remember I learned about it years ago, but I can't remember exactly what it is now. And that's the Schumann resonance.
Okay.
Could you explain that for me?
So the Schumann resonance is a frequency that can be measured. So you could say that it's the sound that the earth radiates, right?
Hmm.
That's how people like to describe it, right? Because at the end it's frequencies and vibrations being emitted by the earth, which are being measured, and then it's being called the Schumann resonance because Schumann was the one who discovered a
Right.
way to measure it. um, so so yeah, at the end of the day, it's a way of, it's 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 almost as if it's us measuring a form of energy that we don't even understand yet.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Hmm.
So we can see that there are these fluctuations taking place, but we don't know what is causing the
Right.
fluctuation, or we haven't been able to fully understand. um in my opinion, we did once understand, and that's why when you look at ancient scriptures like the Vedic literature, um, you can start to begin understanding it, is because we did once know this stuff. It's almost as if we just have forgotten it and we have to
Hmm.
relearn it, you know,
Right. Hmm. Uh,
like on an ancestral level.
hmm. Because I remember when the lockdown first started, there, but maybe a week after, there was this post I seen all over a lot of my feeds saying that there
Yeah,
was going to be a global meditation. And
yeah,
I was like, interesting. I want to be a part of this. So I
yeah,
did it. I followed along. It was like a
yeah,
20-minute.
yeah. I did it too. Yeah,
Awesome. That's so cool.
yeah, yeah,
And then the next
yeah,
day, there was this image of a graph, a measuring of the Schumann resonance. And it
yeah.
shows that during that 20-minute period when we were doing it, it was like super high.
It's
And
spiking.
I didn't
Yeah,
know what exactly it was measuring,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it went from basically just this baseline. And then
yeah,
during that meditation time, it kind of like spiked up. So
yeah,
it kind of made me think about the same idea of the random number generators, the random number
yeah,
generator. Like, so
yeah.
that's so like it's like our collective consciousness has an effect on the frequency that the Earth is putting off as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, the when you compare it to a lot of Eastern philosophies like Chi or like Prana, they talk about Prana or Chi being this life force, quote unquote, life force energy, right?
Right.
So that which sustains life. So for example, when you're in a yoga class, when you're breathing in air, they talk about you breathing in prana, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or when you're drinking water, for example, you're drinking prana.
Mm-hmm.
Or when you're eating food or fruits or vegetables, you're consuming prana, right? You're consuming like a life force energy.
Right.
But you not only get this prana from external, but your body produces it as well, because they say that not only does every animate object produce it, but they say that every atom
Mm-hmm.
has this sort of prana. Or the reason why I link it to electromagnetism is because it's almost as if when you're describing prana and then when you describe electromagnetism, it's kind of interchangeable in a way, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
electromagnetism is also where the lines between matter and energy start to get blurred, you
Right.
know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very, that's where I see an interesting connection. But when it comes to um, the Schumann resonance, I feel like it's kind of us measuring the, the earth's prana, right? So the
Mm.
life force which earth is radiating
Right.
outwards.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're measuring. Actually, the random number generator is really interesting. I want to see if there were like high spikes, not like you told me there was during the meditation, but I also want to see if there were high spikes when like when the outbreak just happened, or like
Mm.
when the outbreak was just announced. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
That could be very similar to how when 9/11 just happened, they aligned, right? So
Right.
maybe even during this negative event,
Yeah.
or the thing is, I think comparing this to comparing this COVID hysteria to what we saw in 2001 is very comparable, to the point where both of them tend to point towards them being false flag operations, because
Mm.
at the end of the day, false flag operations are nothing new, right? They're by now, it's like governments have been orchestrating false flag events for centuries in order to manipulate their populations, right? Like,
Hmm.
for example, um, you can even go as far as back to the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille prison, right? Um, Now we can clearly see that it was an orchestrated revolution, to, as in not the revolution, but it was the storming of the prison was an orchestrated false flag operation to paint a negative image on the people who were revolting against the government, right? So the
Okay.
people wanted a peaceful transformation of their society, but by inciting violence and like storming of like government buildings and stuff, that's kind of like similar to what we're seeing in the States too, with movements like Antifa, for
Mm.
example, right? Where you have the like people, you have billionaires like George Soros who fund these movements, and oftentimes these are the most one, like simply the most, in my from my observations, some of the most violent movements, where it's like their main goal is destruction of property and inciting violence,
Hmm.
um, which in my opinion is not to go about it's not to go about it. You can't go about that in for anything. Like, violence is not the answer to anything, right?
Hmm.
And that's kind of where the line between, like, for example, where the morality lines are drawn is where I feel like your ability to see truth or discernment, like how I mentioned earlier, is directly linked to morality. Because if you can see truth, then you can more clearly see what is right and what is wrong, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes to morality, I feel like people like to complicate it too much, and that's why they start to believe that maybe more morality is subjective, which I
Hmm.
believe it's not. Because when it comes to truth, truth is objective, right? So it
Mm.
doesn't matter on our lens of perception. So basically, for example, if I'm wearing a pair of glasses and I'm looking at an object, and it's super clear to me when I'm wearing the glasses, but when I take them off, it's completely blurry. But it doesn't change the fact that that object is there, and that it exists in the same way. That it doesn't matter whether I'm wearing the glasses or not, right? That
Right.
it's going to exist in the same state.
Hmm.
So that's the same. That's kind of how I look at truth, where truth is this objective. It's objective, but it's our perceptions of the truth that can get clouded, and that's what results in things like ignorance. It's basically a very clouded vision of the truth.
Hmm. Yeah.
um,
That's exactly how I see it too.
yeah,
I had like many years ago when I first started realizing all these things, like the analogy that really made sense to me is that we're all essentially looking out a window at the world.
exactly.
And a lot of our windows are spotted with all kinds of different colors.
Yeah, exactly,
So we're
exactly.
seeing the reality that might be out there as blue, but it comes through a red light and then changes it to purple or whatever.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
but if you basically the spiritual path essentially is cleaning your window,
Exactly.
getting all those colors
Exactly.
off of there so you have
Yes.
a clear, and
Yes.
then get rid of the window entirely, just shatter the
Yeah.
glass,
Yeah.
that shattering is like the because you think you are the window, you shatter the
Yeah.
glass, you like
Yeah.
shatter
I
your
mean, that's
ego.
the end goal. That's a good way to put it, actually.
Hmm.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more with that analogy. And I mean, I feel like, yeah, that's the shattering of the glass is essentially this like explosion of of not only like intense bliss and ecstasy, but you're
Hmm.
also, it's an explosion of your awareness, right? So
Mm.
it's like your cognition. Again, it goes back to like your cognitive ability or your consciousness.
Right.
um it's the shattering of the glass could sort of just represent this, like, reaching that ultimate state
Yeah.
of being able to see truth for what it really is.
Yeah. There's no more
And I
distortion.
think it's yeah, and I think that's very linked to morality, because it's like I said, the over time our perceptions can get clouded, and like you said, the sort of like the spot, a window full of spots, right? So that can sort of create this idea, not only that morality is subjective, but also that it's complicated, right? So it's like
Mm.
this thing that's too complicated to understand, and it's like, who are you to say what's right and what's wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when
Mm-hmm.
it comes to morality, I feel like it's actually so simple to define when you simply define morality like good and bad as whether theft is taking place or not.
Mm.
So if the action results in theft, it's
Mm-hmm.
wrong, and if it doesn't result in theft, it's not wrong. So when you
Right.
look at, for example, murder, right? What is murder?
The taking of a
Murder is
life.
the taking of a life, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is rape? Rape is the taking of someone's sexual liberty,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're taking away that from them.
Their autonomy,
Yeah, you're taking their
their right to
autonomy
choose.
away, exactly, their
Mm-hmm.
sovereignty.
Yeah.
um, Even in my opinion, taxation in its modern form is a form of theft, because
Mm-hmm.
you now have a system where the government forcefully comes in and takes, say, like in my home country in the Caribbean, it's actually upwards of 30% income tax,
Right.
um, which is, it's basically like the government just coming in and saying, hey, we own 30% of you now, and you have no choice. You not only not have a choice in paying us, but you also have no say in where the money goes,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So in essence, that's why I've defined modern taxation as theft as well. um, Basically, the idea of tax can be much more decentralized than what it is right
Mm-hmm.
now. But yeah, if we go back to morality, at the end of the day, it's always the theft of something that results in the action being wrong. So even when it comes to harming someone, or like when you initiate violence against someone, you
Mm-hmm.
are you are you are taking away their right to feel safe,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So basically, you're taking away their right to safety.
Mm-hmm.
um, and then when it comes to so I forgot what I was going to say. So oh yeah, so when it comes to the idea of theft, right? I feel like that is what determines whether the action is wrong or I was going to mention self-defense, actually. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, that's where, if your life is being threatened,
Mm-hmm.
and say you are being accosted, right? Basically, you are not the one initiating the violence,
Right.
but you have to use force
Mm-hmm.
to defend yourself.
Yeah.
If that results in, say, for example, if you're in a situation where it's like either your life or theirs, because someone's like after your life, right?
Yeah.
Someone's like running towards you with like a machete or
Mm-hmm.
or a gun, for example. You have the right to defend yourself from that person, and even if it means like if it ends in you ending that person's life, you
Mm-hmm.
can't automatically consider it as a wrong action, because the violence was being initiated. So the wrong action in that whole timeline was the one who initiated the violence, which is, at the end of the day, violence is just another form of theft.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you are making the choice to hurt them, but it's only because your choice was taken away.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So it's at that point, it's like you have no choice but to
Exactly.
defend yourself.
Unless you want to die.
Yeah, unless you want to die. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what about like, it made me think about this because I've had like discussions with my friends about this before about what if you're like, I think the word is complicit in a system that takes, but you don't really have another choice. And I'll give you an example. Okay. I had a discussion with my friend where we spoke about um, basically choosing to either support meat production or support like big scale type grocery stores. Cause like I
Yeah.
was basically saying that by purchasing meat of any kind, you are taking away the autonomy, taking away the choice of the animal that is born into existence to serve you. Essentially,
Yeah.
you are deciding what their life is. But his defense was that by me going to the grocery store, I'm still giving my money to a system that basically haphazardly, oh my God,
Yeah,
just
haphazardly. Yeah.
takes away the life of like smaller animals in like a big cornfield or something like that.
Yeah.
So I'm still contributing to death, but my defense, I guess, was it's not my choice. I'm not,
Mm,
it's not my intention to
mm,
take the life of the small rodent.
yeah.
It's a consequence of it and I could avoid it. So
Yeah.
my way of going about it is not support factory farming and the destruction of individual beings, but I still buy vegetables and fruits and stuff from an industry that ends up taking lives by proxy of their
Yeah.
actions.
Yeah.
So even like, and I understand where he's coming from. I get that. Yeah, I am still complicit in a system that is taking
Yeah.
lives, but that is kind of the state of every system. Like if I'm buying an Apple phone, I'm contributing to slavery
Yeah.
or, you know, just
Yeah.
terrible working conditions or
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So by being an actor in this system at all, I'm always kind of contributing
Yeah.
to some sort of theft or immorality.
Exactly.
What
Yeah.
is your thoughts on
Ex-
that?
so that's actually an interesting point, because that's where you have to bring up the difference between nescience and ignorance. So for example, if you were to define the two, right, you can probably, or you already know what the definition of ignorance is, right? So
Mhm.
ignorance is is being presented with knowledge or truth, but the willful, it's the action of willfully ignoring that knowledge
Mhm.
is what causes the ignorance, right? That's where the word comes from, ignorance, ignoring,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So, but then when you talk about nescience, that's it's the person is you can't, you have to differentiate from ignorance, because the person hasn't even been presented with the knowledge or truth yet. So it's almost as if the knowledge is not present, and that's what results in their action that can be perceived as ignorance, but it's actually nescience, because the information or knowledge was simply not present. So a good example of this could be like this couple goes on a picnic, right? And they lay out their picnic mat and like all the food, and they're getting a little bit like, basically they go with their kid, but they get a little distracted, right? And then and it's like on this cliff, right? So the kid eventually walks to the edge of the cliff, and so basically, if the kid jumps off, and of course it will result in the death of the child, but that's where you can see where the child died of nescience and not of ignorance, because
Mm.
the kid didn't know that if they fall over that they were going to die.
Right.
Whereas if one of the parents did that, that would be a form of ignorance. Like say if one of the parents did that, it would be them essentially committing suicide, knowing that they're going to die as soon
Right.
as
Right.
they hit the ground, right?
Mhm.
So when it comes to the point you brought up about feeding into the system, a lot of times people's ignorant actions, or what we would perceive as ignorant actions, are actually mainly due to their nescience rather than their ignorance. So
Mhm.
all it takes is presenting them with the truth or knowledge
Mhm.
to, if like, especially in the context of like trying to wake someone up or trying to make them aware of the realities of our world. um, Oftentimes simply presenting them with the information is enough. Of course it depends on their willingness and ability to accept the truth, or you know what I mean. But I mean, that's, of course it's subject to the individual. But in my experience, a lot of times simply by presenting the information is enough to at least get them to start like thinking more critically and more objectively, basically finding that brain balance, you know. So the brain balance simply comes down to essentially being able to, it comes down to this things like discernment, where it's like you being able to see truth, be able to decipher between the two.
Mhm.
um so when it comes to feeding the system, that's kind of like, if you look at the word terminology used there, essentially it's we're feeding the parasites, right?
Mhm.
So that's where you can see a kind of like a parallel there, to the point where, for example, transitioning towards um, more organic farming practices, to the point where you're supporting more local farmers, more farmers that aren't using chemicals and pesticides and herbicides to
Mhm.
produce foods. And actually, that's kind of where I'm kind of where my stance on morality is. Actually, in the past few months, I've been drastically cutting down my meat intake. Actually, it's been something on my mind the past few years where I was like, okay, I'm a meat eater, but I, I, I do know for a fact that you can get health benefits from reducing your meat intake, right?
Mm.
So, of course, that also depends on the individual's physiology, but in my opinion, I feel like health wise, it just makes more sense for me to be cutting down on my meat intake. And I've, I'm now going on like almost 3 months without having consumed any meat whatsoever.
Mhm.
But that's kind of where I draw the line. Like, for example, with vegans, I feel like when it comes to the veganism movement, I feel like sometimes it's a bit too extreme, because when you look at their definition for being a vegan, it's them not wanting to harm animals, right? So they don't
Mhm.
want to contribute to any system or anything that can result in the harming of animals.
Right.
But then when it comes to like things like drinking milk or having honey or butter or basically animal products,
Mhm.
um, I feel like if you for a fact know, like for example, the project I'm building in Thailand is actually a permaculture food forest project. It's
Okay.
actually like a hybrid between like a resort retreat center and like a food sanctuary
Okay.
almost.
Cool.
Um, so, and we're planning to have it be the most organic. So we're using like zero chemicals. And if we even do use pesticides, it's all natural pesticides. So for
Mhm.
example, we're using neem oil to repel aphids and, uh, and like pests. So basically we know for a fact that it's actually more for us, but at the same time, it's going to be for the resort and then even for the local communities, because with the food forestry model, you can have like an abundance of production.
Mhm.
So for example, that's where I kind of draw the line with when it comes to veganism, is because we are also eventually planning to have to be keeping bees pollinate our forests. So not only does that increase our production, but we're also creating honey in our system, right?
Mhm.
Um, so and that's where I kind of draw the line, because if the animals are being treated with the utmost respect, so say for example, we do have a few goats where we are getting goat milks out of, so that we could make things like goat's cheese for the property, right?
Mhm.
um, if we're showing so much like unconditional love to the goat,
Mhm.
and making sure that it has the best life ever and it has the freedom of movement to move wherever it wants,
Mhm.
I don't see how there's any harm being done there.
Mm.
So that by definition actually makes it a vegan thing. So you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Does that make sense? So for example, if there's no harm being done, that's what makes it vegan, right?
Right. Well, I guess
So
the only thing I would say, where I would be, I guess I would have an idea of concern is that, um, if, you know, if you had this goat and you went to milk the goat and
yeah,
the goat showed no resistance to you doing that, then it obviously doesn't care that you're doing it. So by all
yeah,
means, you're not violating its rights.
exactly.
But like, I guess the only issue I have like with milk production is in the mass scale where,
The factory farming
yeah,
aspect.
they would
Yeah,
take the milk is
the
for the calf,
machines.
right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
they would take, if you are when you have your goats, if you're taking the calf or whatever they call a baby goat, away from its mother so you could take the milk, I would see that
yeah.
as a moral issue.
Of course. Yeah, of course. Same
Also,
here.
if you're bringing them into existence to be a commodity for you, like
Yeah,
you are making them live just so they could be a product for you. That's
yeah,
where I see a moral
yeah,
issue. But if the
yeah,
goat was already alive and your
yeah,
buddy owned it on a sanctuary, and then you say, "Hey,
yeah.
can your goat move where
Well,
I live?"
the idea is that it is actually to have it, because the whole idea of food forestry is where you're mimicking systems in nature, right? So
Mhm.
you're taking a piece of land and you're not only reforesting it, but you're not only like using it for agriculture, but you're reforesting the land as well.
Right. Yeah.
So in essence, the goats will not, their only reason for being is not going to be just for goat's milk. It's also going to be for what it does out in nature. So basically what a goat's function out in nature would be is like it eats grass, right?
Yeah.
And then it poops out the grass, and then that the poop ends up becoming fertilizer for more plants, for more grass to grow, right?
Right.
So so essentially it's going to be this ecosystem where there is freedom of movement, and it's almost as if we're simulating what that animal's life would be like even if it was out in nature.
Yeah.
Same like with the bees. Like the bees will basically they'll end up creating hives throughout or like on certain trees based on the trees that they're pollinating.
Right. Yeah. It
And
always
it'll be yeah.
It always comes
Sorry,
down to
what?
a freedom issue with me. You know what I mean? Like if the goat is free to live its life, and
Yeah.
like and when you go to milk it, it doesn't have a issue with that, then I
Yeah.
don't see any issue.
Yeah.
But it's when when you artificially inseminate a goat, you know,
Yeah,
or
or
you
sometimes they even inject like hormones for it to produce more milk. That's, of course, it's wrong.
Yeah. Like I only see, like, I don't know what like the goat quote industry is like, but I
Yeah,
just, did some research into the cow and cattle and milk industry. And
yeah,
when they artificially inseminate, that's just a euphemism for essentially rape. Like when you really
yeah,
think about it, they're shoving
exactly.
their entire arm into the anus of a cow to
Yeah,
grab its cervix and open it, and then they shove this rod into its vagina
yeah,
to
and then
like inject
yeah,
semen after they've taken the semen by sexually assaulting the
the
bull.
male, yeah,
And then
yeah,
when the calf is born, they take away the baby, and then the mother cow basically pines for days, if not weeks, because she misses her young. And
yeah,
like, so that's where it gets real immoral. But like,
exactly.
if you didn't make the goat, if you didn't rape a goat to bring another goat into
Yeah,
existence, then,
yeah,
and the goat is just there, and there's just goats all around, and you're just saying, hey, can I have some of your milk? And the goat gladly gives you its milk, then I see no
yeah,
moral issue with that.
yeah, yeah. Same here.
Hmm.
I mean, it's all about respect, right? So as long as there's that unity feeling. Basically, you know how they say that like the idea is that it's immoral because you can see that the animals it's actually exhibiting a negative emotion, right? So when
Yeah,
you're killing an animal, you can see that it's in pain. When you're
of
doing
course.
artificial insemination and or like taking away a calf from its cow, you can
Hmm.
see that it goes into a depression.
Of course. Yeah.
Um, whereas if you're keeping, I feel like if you're if the psychological or if the state of the being is remains optimal, then
Hmm.
there's no harm being done there, and in essence it doesn't make it immoral.
Right. Hmm.
Basically there's no rights that are being infringed by the animal,
Mm.
so to the point where it's a system where it's open fenced, right? So even if the goats wanted to go out or wherever they want, they could, but they would want to stay because of the abundance that there is in that system.
Right.
So because there's going to be an abundance of food for them and for
Yeah.
so that they and their young can have like the best lives
Yeah.
or like that. It's just keep it's like an ecosystem, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah, that makes sense
so
to me,
yeah,
especially if you're
and
offering the being
yeah,
its own freedom. Like if,
exactly,
if it has the freedom to leave, but it comes back because it likes where it is, then that's its own decision, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Hmm.
And also it also comes down to moderation, right? So you could have abundance, but then it's still, that doesn't mean that we should be these like power hungry or energy
Mm.
hungry, or we shouldn't hoard, basically, right?
Yeah.
um
Exactly.
so the whole idea of abundance is using moderately so that you could share as
Mm.
well. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Exactly. You have
That's
access
the
to abundance, but
exactly,
you aren't taking it all for yourself.
exactly.
Like you're in a state where you're like, I know I have access to everything I want. I could have everything and
Yeah,
anything I want,
yeah,
but I'm
yeah,
choosing to limit myself to what
Exactly.
I need and maybe a little bit more of what I want, just to
Exactly.
feel some sense of pleasure.
Exactly.
But
So
I'm
so
doing this so
yeah.
others can feel that sense of
Yeah.
abundance as well.
Exactly. So in the context of the goat, for example, you
Mhm.
could even incorporate it into the system where you know for a fact that the 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 calf or like the baby goats are receiving are drinking the same amount they would even if you weren't milking the goat. You know what
Mm.
I mean?
Mhm.
So what you're harvesting is actually excess
The
milk
surplus.
that the goat, yeah, it's the surplus
Yeah,
that the goat produces.
exactly. Yeah.
So in that sense, you're, because a lot of times people would argue and say, oh, but you're still taking milk away from the goat. But if you are able to measure that and know for a fact that whether you're milking the goat or not, the babies are still getting the same amount of milk,
Mhm.
that's where you're like, that's how you know that that's how you know for sure that what you're harvesting is the surplus.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
that's exactly right. Like if you have the knowledge, if you've studied goats and you know like this baby goat only needs so many liters a day
Yeah.
and it drinks it all, and
Yeah.
then after it's done feeding for the day, you go in and you take the surplus, and then the next day the baby goat still has more than enough. Then
Yeah.
as long as you're studying and you understand how
Yeah.
much you can take without taking away from the baby, then
Exactly.
I don't see
And
the problem.
also by controlling the nourishment of the goat.
Mm,
So for example, because you know what's it's being fed, right? You're feeding it with the most wholesome, natural thing that it's supposed to be eating, right?
mhm.
And you know for a fact there's no chemicals, there's no, and so in essence you can even enhance the goat's ability to produce milk
Right.
by controlling what it's consuming. So if you
Yeah.
could, and I mean, and when I mean control what it's consuming, I mean more replicating what it would eat out in nature.
Mhm.
So because at the end of the day, that's how it would create the most optimal. That's how it would have the most optimal bodily function. So for
Yeah,
example,
exactly.
like oftentimes these people use hormones and stuff to get more milk, but the quality of the milk is bad because
Mhm.
it's riddled with these chemicals and these hormones, right?
Yeah.
Um, so so yeah,
But yeah,
that's kind of, yeah,
nature provides an abundance, so that that goat is
exactly.
naturally going to produce more than its calf needs.
Exactly. Same with the bees, for example. Like, so if you look at the analogy of bees, they they keep creating honey their whole lives because they've been genetically predisposed to do that. So you could say
Mhm.
so you could say the life purpose of a bee is to create honey, even if there is enough honey to sustain the hive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So throughout their whole lifespan, they're going to create honey to the point where the reason why they create honey in the first place is so that they can hibernate and so that they have food in the winter.
Mhm.
Um, but there's it's the nature of bees is that they create honey, and that's what results in the overwhelming surplus of their production, and
Mhm.
that's what makes them so efficient, is and that's why they say that bees are so efficient, is because they're able to, they're like one of the biological organisms in nature that are able to create such a mass, um, basically something that can be considered as abundance, right? So it's not,
Mhm.
you can't, it's still limited, but basically the hive was never going to consume all of that at once. So you can even, so even in that sense you can make sure that you're only harvesting the surplus,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
and that,
It's like abundant, it's infinite from a relative perspective, the same way
yeah,
the sun is. Like the sun is gonna
yeah,
last, I don't know, another like 10 billion years or something like that.
yeah,
So as long and like chances are the human race won't last that long. And even if we do, we could just move to another planet because
yeah,
at that point, you would hope that we'd have the technology by then. But
yeah,
from our perspective, since that's such a far off point in time where the sun burns out, at this point, it's relatively infinite because the energy is
yeah,
going to keep coming for the rest of my life and your life and
exactly,
the next 20 to I don't know, a
yeah,
thousand generations after that.
yeah,
So in a relative perspective, the sun gives off infinite energy, but
yeah,
no thing is inherently infinite. The sun will burn out and then it will transform into different energy and shoot its
yeah,
guts and supernova and all that good stuff.
yeah,
But Yeah, but from a relative perspective, it is infinite. So that's kind of the same thing with the bees. Like the bees are creating more than enough they need for their entire life cycle. But that
Yeah,
was just like a
exactly.
consequence of their evolution to
Yeah,
produce more and more just in case. They were always,
exactly.
thinking just in case. So
Exactly.
if we keep them going by helping them maintain themselves and just taking their surplus,
Yeah.
then it like you said, it's kind of like an ecosystem. You kind of
Yeah.
depend on each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so so the idea is when it comes to harvesting, is harvesting the surplus, or
Hmm.
either the entirety of the surplus or less than that, right? So not
Yeah,
more than that.
exactly.
You never
Yeah.
exceed that.
Mhm.
And wait, I forgot what I was gonna say. Sorry. Yeah, it was
No worries.
just lost my train of thought there.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so it's actually, yeah, I just got it. So it was very interesting when you compared it to solar, actually, because us, for example, using solar panels to harvest solar energy is is it's the same as us harvesting the surplus of the energy. So for example, you know how the earth is using the sun's energy to be able to produce trees and plants,
Mm.
and so that biological organisms can sustain and thrive. um, so solar panels is actually the same exact thing as harvesting the surplus of this energy, because this
Yes,
is all the extra that it's this extra abundance that it's generating.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. So that actually brings me back to like the thing I want to talk about again. We slightly touched on it, but I want to get more deeply into it. And just to give you a time reference, I got about 45 minutes, so that
Okay.
should be plenty of
Yeah.
time to go over this. I
Yeah.
want to talk about like I guess how would these free energy type systems work from what you know, from the knowledge you've gathered. How would like maybe a 0 point energy machine operate from, or maybe even like we've talked about electromagnetism. How do we harness the electromagnetic field that we live within? And I remember you mentioning
Yeah.
the last time we spoke about how you kind of see anti-gravity machines as somewhat tied to electromagnetism in general. So I'd
Yeah.
like to hear more about that and what do you think about it?
So when it comes to this sort of 0 point concept,
Hmm.
that's where I'm seeing like there's sort of like a difference between that's where I'm seeing that it could be two different types of systems. So for example, the idea of electromagnetism, now I'm actually coming to the realization that at the end of the day, if you even if we take electromagnetism as this abundant resource, it's actually quite similar to solar, in the sense that we're harvesting the surplus, right? So
Hmm.
it's like the earth is constantly radiating this energy, but we're just harvesting the surplus. But then when it comes to the concept of 0 point energy, it's basically the idea that it requires an initial charge, and then the perpetual motion is initiated by the initial charge. So basically the initial charge gets multiplied by the device, or the so-called technology, or the invented technology.
Okay.
um, so that initial charge, the device basically converts the initial charge and relays it, and then multiplies it into two, and then when the two reach the other side of of the device, or if say you're looking at it as a circuitry or a system, right?
Hmm.
It then again reaches a point where it goes in as two, but then comes out as four. So it's almost
Hmm.
as if you're creating this this like uh, device that all it requires is an initial charge, and then it just keeps replicating and keeps. So basically you have that where it goes back to the whole idea of intensity and continuity, where all you're doing is initiating that movement, and both the intensity and the continuity is happening simultaneously,
Okay.
right?
Hmm.
So and then when you look at, again, when it goes back to the Vedic texts, when you look at when they talk about free energy, they actually talk about the harnessing of what we are now calling prana, or life force, or
Hmm.
chi, or actually what conventional science, due to their recent discoveries, is calling bioelectricity.
Hmm.
um, so that, I think, I think this concept of bioelectricity is, I think, what might lead us to the invention of free energy technology.
Hmm.
Whereas electromagnetism could be similar to an energy harnessing. It's similar to solar in terms of energy harnessing, to the point where, because at the end of the day, I guess it would even depend on the location of where the device is in, right? So when you're taking electromagnetism into consideration, you would probably need to go. You would probably, for it to generate more energy, it would need to be in a location where there's more of an electromagnetic force, right?
Hmm. Right.
So at the end of the day, that still makes it conditional. Whereas this concept of bioelectricity and the idea that it's a device that can keep replicating, in the Vedic text, they talk about uh, coming to understanding this technology, building it. Basically, you know how Tesla says he used to create, he used to invent in his mind
Mm.
and only work on it after he's done. So basically, he would create a prototype in his mind and literally put it to test in his mind. Whereas a lot of modern scientists and inventors would invent something, test it, and then based on what it does wrong, they'll fix it.
Yeah.
Whereas he used to invent it in his mind, do the testing in his mind, and then find out what was wrong with it,
Yeah.
event to the point where he would eventually reach a point where he, in his mind, he would have the perfect version, the perfect functional version of
Hmm.
what he was trying to create, and then he would create it. So similarly with this technology, it will come about with us understanding the technology, inventing it in our minds, in our consciousness, putting it to test, refining it until we can actually implement it. And
Hmm.
it will require, the initial charge will come from the inventor, right? So it'll come from the bioelectricity that the inventor radiates. So for example, that, I think I sent you a study that compares the concept of bioelectricity and the measurable aspects of it, and they compare it to the Eastern philosophy of chi,
Hmm.
right? And how they were able to measure bioelectricity radiating from the hands of chi practice, the people who practice
Right.
harnessing chi, right, or like centering chi.
Hmm.
um, so it's almost as if the initial charge is going to be this. It could even be just like the inventor being in this sort of like mind state, because at the end of the day, remember how I kept saying how the both spiritual involvement and free energy are kind of linked.
Hmm.
So it's kind of as if the inventor also reaches a point in their consciousness where they're able to radiate the specific type and amount of energy needed to initiate the perpetual motion of the device.
Right. And it's
um,
interesting you say that. In my research last night, I actually came across a CIA document that proves the validity of chi. I
yeah,
think it might have
so
been recently declassified, and which is
yeah,
interesting because, like you said, all kinds of truth is coming to the surface.
yeah,
Whereas
exactly.
chi, by Western standards, was just considered quackery before.
Yeah, they would label it, so that's kind of the whole idea of the rigid skeptical
Yeah.
academia, where they put labels on things and then
Hmm.
use those labels as excuses not to look further into
Yeah.
something.
Hmm.
So they'll label it pseudoscience, and then oftentimes it evolves into argument of authority, because oftentimes in future generations, so like decades later, someone will directly cite the fact that that person, this authoritative figure who can be considered the god of science,
Mm.
um, but just because that person labeled it as pseudoscience makes it
Yeah.
pseudoscience. You know what I
Exactly. Yeah.
mean? That's kind
Hmm.
of like what I meant by with Einstein and his theories, and how he tends to be very propped up in modern academia,
Hmm.
and like people are not very open to the possibility that, yeah, some of his theories can be disproven. At the end of the
Hmm.
day, that's what a theory is, right? Something that hasn't been proven yet.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
essentially, Einstein's theories by definition can be disproven, because
Hmm.
at the end of the day, they're still theories.
Hmm.
Like for example, the theory of gravity. if you tell a very like a rigidly skeptical person that the theory of gravity is just a theory,
Mhm.
they'll they will look at you in a very condescending way. I've gotten this
Mm.
before, where after uttering those words, where I said, at the end of the day, the theory of gravity is just a theory, and then they
Mhm.
look at you as that you're less intelligent than they are.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That comes from the rigid skepticism,
Mhm.
where they'll even go as far as like dropping an object and
Mm.
then using that as like, oh yeah, there, see, that's
Yeah.
what happened.
Yeah. And
But
it's not that you're
but
denying its
yeah,
effects.
exactly. I'm not denying the effects. I'm
Mhm.
just simply stating that we don't know that it's the force of gravity that caused that object to be,
Yeah.
for it to have been like magnetized to the ground.
Right. Yeah.
And that's kind of where I feel like electromagnetism kind of disproves Einstein's gravitational theory, in the sense that
Mhm.
it could be the force of electromagnetism that's causing all matter to be drawn to the ground,
Right.
where instead of this force of gravity, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, when you think about it, like, I'm not sure if I'm understanding this correctly, but at the core of our Earth, there's this like molten core that has this
Exactly,
electromagnetic pull, and
exactly,
it's constantly basically in a state of flux or spin.
exactly.
So, when if you were to take the analogy of maybe something like spinning in place on the ground, like if some like say for some reason you had like a screw that was able to spin in place, it's going to go further and further down into the ground and create this hole. So it's
Yeah,
like that molten core is spinning into the fabric of space-time, and then that spin itself is creating a hole in space-time which draws everything in around it.
yeah,
But that doesn't
exactly.
mean it doesn't have the
Yeah,
opposite
yeah,
effect. Like if you spun the other
ex-
way, would it shoot everything outwards?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And that's kind of like what I meant because when I was like introducing myself, I sort of mentioned that nature is like my best teacher.
Mm.
Because I've noticed that by going out and just observing plants or birds or trees, that you actually start understanding a lot of these physical forces, right? So for
Yeah.
example, when you look at the progression of a tree, or the progression of a seed, going from a seed to a plant and then from a
Mhm.
plant to a tree, um, it's almost as if, and when you're thinking in terms of gravity, right? So that's actually kind of what enhanced me being able to cognize that it's not the force of gravity, and that it's more likely this force of electromagnetism. Because for example, when you look at a seed, when you plant the seed, it's it's the it's the electromagnetic charge of the atoms within the roots that, in my opinion, causes it to be drawn more deeper into the ground.
Mm.
Whereas the 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 atoms that make up what happens above the ground are actually made up of atoms with certain electrical they're basically atoms with certain electromagnetic fields that allow it to be pushed up instead of down.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So, because a lot of times gravity can explain things like that. So basically, for example, the idea of that the force of gravity exists would mean that it kind of goes back to the idea of energy, and the idea of continuity and intensity. Because when you define the force of gravity, you're talking more in terms of what they describe as physical force and energy, right? So, and in physical terms, like, so in modern academia physics terms, they would describe, they usually describe invisible forces as energy, and then visible forces as matter, right? That's
Mhm.
what they do, not realizing that the two are actually one. And that's kind of what I meant by it's actually E equals mc, where energy equals matter. So energy is equal to the continuity and the intensity.
Right.
um, so in essence, even if you take gravity as a force, and by their definition, it would be an ever intense force, right? So it's not there's no continuity to the point where it's visible matter. They're defining it more as energy, where they they're talking more about the intensity aspect. So in essence, if the force of gravity, if you take it in context of how they explain things in modern academia, it would essentially pull everything. You know what I mean? So it would be like an ever increasing force that's
Hmm.
like literally pulling everything. So you could say that. I mean, they talk about how different planets could have like either more or less of a gravitational pull, but
Hmm.
at the end of the day, I feel like that's
Oh, you froze up. Oh no.
again can be directly related to, so due to the makeup of their core. So like certain cores could be made up of different like a composition, right? So that's where like chemistry comes into place, where like a mixture of certain chemicals can radiate a certain electromagnetic field.
Hmm. You
Um,
froze up there for a second. I wonder if I missed anything
oh no.
integral.
So I said about that, the idea of that the core is made up of like these. At the end of the day, it's these molten rock and
Hmm.
metals, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like that's essentially what's creating this electromagnetic field, which eventually it's basically all systems in nature are relying on this electromagnetic field to exist.
Mm.
um,
Hmm.
and that's kind of where I'm seeing the lines between gravity and electromagnetism, to the point where they tend to be sharing a lot of the same qualities, but then electromagnetism is more explicable than the force of gravity.
Yeah. And there's this constant, I guess, endeavor to try to unite the two. You know, they look for a
Yeah,
grand unified theory that will relate gravity to electromagnetism. But
yeah,
I feel
yeah,
like it is the same thing happening just on different scales. Like that's the way
yeah,
it makes sense to me. And
yeah,
the way I kind of picture it is like you picture this like kind of infinite lattice or matrix of lines, and then it's all like straight lines. But then if at one point one of those lines start to curve in on itself, it'll create this vortex which goes downward, and
yeah,
that creates a quote gravity well.
yeah,
So that's what
yeah,
happens when you have a piece of matter. A piece of matter is a spin,
yeah,
and that spin in the lattice or the matrix of reality of space-time creates this pull, either downwards, upwards, whatever. It goes in a certain direction. So
yeah,
when that like 2 points at where energy collide, they when they collide, they create this vortex, and then that vortex
yeah,
uh, basically penetrates a new dimension,
yeah.
and then pulls
Essentially, yes.
energy
Yeah,
through to it. So that's kind of
yeah,
what the core, it started with just maybe a single piece, a single particle, which, created that penetration into another dimension. And that created that gravity well, which brought
yeah,
in more particles like itself, more dust, more gas, which
yeah,
basically turned into more solid matter, into rocks and minerals. And that
yeah,
created, eventually it kind of coalesces into the earth itself. But at the core, it's where the most energy is going because everything's being pulled towards there. So it's always hot. It
yeah,
remains in this molten state because
yeah,
all the energy is being pulled towards it. So when you
yeah,
create that molten core, it's
yeah.
constantly pulling everything in towards it. And
Yeah.
that's what essentially creates the quote force of gravity.
Of
But
gravity,
it's
yeah,
still the
yeah,
same thing as electromagnetism in the sense
yeah,
that it's just a charged
yeah,
point in space time that penetrates into another dimension of reality.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, actually, another thing that actually it's to do with not only free energy, but when you start looking at technologies such as electromagnetic levitation,
Mm,
essentially you're talking about a technology which a lot of people describe as anti-gravity, right?
right. Hmm.
So when you're talking about electromagnetic levitation, you're talking about the defiance of the law of gravity,
Right.
right?
Right.
But in physics, we know that the laws of physics can't, because at the end of the day, what are the laws? When we're studying the laws of physics, we're literally trying to understand the laws of nature, right? Like the
Hmm.
laws of the systems around us.
Yeah.
Um, so so if someone who is truly like who is truly able to grasp that idea that the study of physics is them understand or trying to cognize the world around them,
Hmm.
they would know that it's impossible to defy these laws.
Mm.
You know what I mean? So so essentially the so if anti-gravity craft or like an electromagnetic levitational craft is created, it essentially the creation of that technology directly disproves it's like it automatic just the fact that that technology was created will disprove the force of gravity, because essentially it's you having to come to a point where you're admitting that a law of physics can be defied or not.
Hmm.
You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Yeah. So
um,
so there has to be other characteristics to that law that we aren't seeing.
exactly.
So it
Yeah,
doesn't always pull down. You
exactly.
can vibrate in a way that goes against the pull.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And then when you start describing it, isn't that like what it's kind of like the same as like repelling a magnet instead of attracting it,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
So
So it is electromagnetism just on a different scale. Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Essentially it's like the craft will, and my this is how I see it, like when I tried it, like to like comprehend this technology,
Mhm.
is it being a craft that can calculate what the electromagnetic field looks like around the craft and then
Mhm.
directly repel against that so that it
Mhm.
can manipulate and go wherever it wants to go.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
it's constantly calculating and constantly repelling. It's constantly creating the opposite charge. I mean, not the opposite
Yes.
charge. It's creating the same charge
The
because,
complementary charge.
yeah, a complementary charge. Because
Mhm.
if it was creating an opposite, it would attract.
The same way like
Um,
some molecules are hydrophobic,
yeah,
moving
exactly,
through water, and they aren't affected by water
exactly.
because
It's the
they
same thing.
repel the charge of water itself.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
you could create a craft that has the capacity to resonate at a certain frequency.
Yes.
And then using some sort of technology, some sort of perhaps like computer type AI type of understanding, it
Yeah.
can
It could
uh,
even be the number generators.
yeah, it could
Yeah.
detect it
Yeah.
detects the field around it, right?
Yeah.
Like you're saying. So
Exactly.
so the
Essentially.
craft
Yeah.
itself has a mechanism to detect the field of which it is in, measure its frequency, and then produce the complementary
The complementary.
frequency that
Exactly.
allows it to move through it at will.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
go
Yeah.
ahead.
In essence, the actually when you as you saying that made me realize this is when you said that creating the complementary charge. That's essentially the craft living in harmony with the electromagnetic field, right? It's
Mm,
creating the same frequency. It's creating the complementary charge. It's replicating the same charge. So it's like,
mhm,
in a way, it's like it's working because it's achieving harmony with the electromagnetic field.
right.
You know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
like it I think it's safe to say at this point that we know that technology is done. Like, um,
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Bob Lazar. You know Bob
No,
Lazar?
I'm not.
He
He sounds familiar, but if
he
can you?
worked he worked on I guess like black type projects for I can't remember who he worked for exactly, but basically back in the 50s or 60s when there was a lot of UFO sightings and crashes. Bob Lazar worked for an industry that uh, went and got these crafts, and then he was told, "You have to reverse engineer this. These crafts somehow
Oh yeah,
defy the
yeah.
laws of gravity."
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it was part of his job to study these crafts and try to reverse engineer so he could figure out how to do it themselves. And he's recently come out, like I think he's been vocal about it for a while now, but he's again resurfaced. There was a documentary that he put out recently that talks about his experience with that. But there's a lot more coming out in general of that, like people saying, yeah, we had this technology, the US government has had this technology for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I read a book last year sometime that talked about how the Nazis were studying this technology back in the 40s and 30s and
Yeah.
40s and trying
Yeah.
to figure it out then. And there was, I think that's what, I could be butchering this, but I think the Foo Fighters, like I've learned from that book that the band, the Foo Fighters, got their name from these like little circular orbs that had the capacity to defy these laws. I could be getting this mixed up with something entirely, but that the general idea I'm going for is that there was this technology known to exist back in the 30s and 40s, and many governmental institutions have studied it and reproduced it. So, like, even if per se aliens have not been here, we at least know that we have the technology that we think was always them. And what I mean
Yeah.
is that, like, in like quote, in Area 51 for one, um,
Yeah.
we don't know that the craft that people see around there is actually from extraterrestrials,
Yeah.
but there are technologies that have been produced out of there that replicate what we've always been told is not possible by man's construction and by
Yeah.
man's compliance with our current laws of physics. So there is technologies beyond what we've been told. Like, we do have the capacity for quote anti-gravity technologies, but like you said, it's not actually going against gravity. It's just manipulating the actual force of gravity in a
Yeah.
way that works with it rather than
Yeah.
going against it.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh yeah. I kind of I pretty much like completely resonate with the idea that that these kinds of technologies have been purposefully suppressed by
Hmm.
governments, by governmental institutions. Um, but then when I start, that sort of gives me an inkling, right? That gives me an inkling that okay, we do have this technology. It already exists, and the fact that the reason why we think of it as being aliens is because it's being suppressed, and then we're being told that this is not possible by
Right.
humans, right?
Hmm.
um, but then the thing that confirms my belief in the fact that that technologies like this exist and that they're being suppressed is that when you start looking at like the ancient scriptures, like for example in the Vedic texts, there are literally blueprints on how to build. They call it Vimana. So the Sanskrit term is Vimana, and Vimana refers to flying craft.
Mm.
So essentially, they're described of as being flying chariots,
Hmm.
but it's essentially, when you look at the shape, like when you look at the blueprints, it's like shaped like this like dome shape, right? Almost like
Hmm.
a UFO. And then and it's like it's super intricate, like super detailed blueprints, dimensions, the type of technology used. It's just, I think it's still being decoded now, you know what I
Hmm.
mean? So that's why and that's why we have, like for example with the Nazis, when you brought up the Nazis, right? Hitler was actually trying to invent this technology so that it would help his regime,
Hmm.
but he was going about inventing this technology by looking at the Vedas and essentially trying to build the technologies outlined in these texts. And then that's why you have his symbol as well. So like the Nazi symbol, he took a sacred symbol, but then usually that's kind of what these institutions do, is they'll take a symbol and then they invert it.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? So when you see the, for example, when you look at the Nazi symbol, it's the swastika, which is a sacred Hindu symbol of light and like love and compassion,
Hmm.
but they tilt it.
Yeah.
So that's where you see that it's like a derivative of that. So it's like, that's how like like for example, a lot of my friends who have visited India, they'll be like, oh yeah, I saw Nazi signs everywhere, and I was like, no, that's not a Nazi sign.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so
Yeah.
so but yeah, and then I don't, and then it's like another, I don't see it as, the thing is, it reaches a point where you start seeing too many things that you would previously perceive as coincidence, but
Mhm.
then you're now starting to realize that it's not coincidence. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So for example, it's not a coincidence that most inventors that were on the verge of breakthrough were studying the same thing. So for example, I just mentioned like Hitler's and his regime that were on, like, some say they were successful in creating these craft.
Mhm.
Some say that they were on the verge, but then Hitler's regime was like dismantled before
Right.
he could.
Mhm.
Um, but then when you see the fact that they were both getting the information from the same source, I don't see that as a coincidence.
Right.
You know what I
Exactly.
mean?
Yeah. And
Um,
you know, a lot of the greatest inventors, you know, they will have some sort of connection to sacred texts as well. Like
exactly. Yeah.
apparently Isaac Newton did more studying of spirituality and religion than he did of physics.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was one of his greatest interests. But then
Yeah.
modern day scientists will be like, yeah, he may have been smart, but he was also a Christian. So we got, you know, he's
Yeah.
not everybody is
Yeah.
perfect, right? But they see
Yeah.
that as his weakness, where in reality,
Exactly. Where it's what contributed to his breakthroughs.
exactly. And like you said
So
with Tesla as well, Tesla was very
yeah.
aware of ancient texts
Yeah.
and the knowledge they shared.
Yeah. And also I find it interesting how, like, many theories that today modern academia takes as like uncontested fact, um, by the people who it's funny to me that oftentimes when you go back and look into the history of these theories, these theorists are often like very taken aback by the by the amount that their theory has been able to change people's thinking, to the point where they were like, oh shit, wait guys, like chill out, you know.
Mm,
um, like for example with Einstein, and some of his writings, you can even see how he expresses this sort of feeling where he proposed certain theories, but then everyone was like getting super excited and was like, oh my god, you solved the answer to the universe and the big question as to what this realm is. And
mhm.
then basically he was feeling as if he was feeling as though at the end of the day, he deep down he knew he was just proposing a theory, but he was like taken aback by the fact that it was so easy to like change everyone's mind and have them
Mhm.
think in a certain way. So for
Right.
example, even when it comes to Darwin's a lot of Darwin's theories, in his writings he talks about how um, he expresses that people should still stay open-minded when looking at his theories. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
So he expresses how important and actually how scientific it is to remain open-minded to the fact that a lot of his theories could be disproved.
Yeah.
And that's the same story where a lot of times you can see how he expressed um, actually quite comically how he was like, yeah, I came up with these theories, and okay, they're based on my observations and what I perceive to be reality, but at the same time he was so surprised that everyone would just out of nowhere just start accepting it and believing it as fact.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And which at its core is unscientific.
Yeah,
Because
exactly. Yeah.
when you stop studying something and placing labels on them, that's it, and by its very definition is unscientific.
Mhm. Agreed.
um, yeah.
Mhm. Quest for truth must go on.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's only one more thing I want to talk about that we haven't really touched on it, and that was like the technology of sound in general. Because I've heard theories that the ways in which the pyramids were built was using sound, the resonance
Yeah.
of certain frequencies to
Yeah.
lift certain stones, and the same with a
Yeah.
lot of different monoliths around the world, be it Stonehenge or whatever.
Yeah.
Because obviously our current technology can't explain how those things were formed.
Yeah.
But using sound, it seems that we can do a lot more than what we're doing right now. And
Yeah.
one thing that comes to my mind is that when I was a kid, I can remember learning about how everything kind of had a resonant frequency that you could destroy with just sound. And this absolutely blew my mind. I remember being really young and hearing that. I don't remember where this was, and I honestly don't even know if it was an actual event, but there was a bridge like similar to that of perhaps the San Francisco Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge. It was constructed, but then something basically elicited some sound that vibrated it to the point that the material structure broke down. And that's kind of the same idea as, like, when you sing a certain high note, you can
And then the
shatter
glass
glass.
breaks. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a resonant frequency for everything. You know what I mean? You can find the resonant frequency for any
For any
object,
atom.
and
Yeah.
you can manipulate it that way. So
Exactly.
if that's the case, then you could take massive stone blocks that are
Megalithic
like
blocks. Yeah. Yeah.
multiple
Yeah.
tons in weight, but then if
Yeah.
you are able to produce the sound at which that complements that particular stone, you could maybe perhaps raise
Levitate
the
it.
stone, you
Yeah.
could levitate
Yeah.
it, you could break it down,
Exactly.
you could cause it to crumble. So
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, I'm just curious, like, have you looked into that concept much yourself? Like, do you understand, uh, like, do you see that as a viable theory for actually how the major monoliths were built?
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting you bring up sound, because today, just through like a conversation with a friend earlier over the phone, we were just like brainstorming a bit, and like just throwing some ideas back and forth at each other, and we started seeing this bridge between sound and visuals, right? So we were
Mhm.
talking in the context of our senses, um, talking in terms of how we hear certain frequencies, and then a lot of other frequencies we see. So, for example, when you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, we're also still talking about a scale of frequencies, right? Where to the point where the only spectrum of that whole, the only part of that whole spectrum that we can observe is the visible light spectrum. So you can
Mhm.
see it's like that rainbow colored highlighted part of that entire scale, right?
Yeah.
um, so in the same way, there's we started seeing how um, the two could be as in both visual, like our visual sensory input and audio sensory input could be very similar, in the sense that both are frequencies that at specific frequencies tend to vibrate and manifest as
Mm.
matter. That's kind of like what the idea we had is, basically the energy, that's kind of like how energy is equal to matter, in the sense that the energy is tuned to a certain frequency, and the tuning happens via any sort of, it happens either naturally, or in the case of free energy and electromagnetic levitation, we're trying to tune it to a certain frequency, right? So that's
Mhm.
why we would need a device to be able to tune it to a certain frequency to in order to create the desired vibration. But in a natural context, it's manifesting as the desired vibration of the ether, right? So of the universe.
Mhm.
um so, and that's where I see the connection between free energy, electromagnetic, uh, free energy, and also like electromagnetic levitation, and how I see how both incorporate the concept of vibration. And at the end of the day, sound is vibration, right? So I feel like the two are heavily linked. And then you brought up the idea of megalithic structures, right? So to me, a lot of these ancient sites serve to me as more. It just serves as more proof that the ancients had these more advanced technologies, because a lot of these structures, when you go to visit them, or even if you like watch a video on them or anything, when you see the not only the architecture, but like the weight of these huge rocks that they were using to build these structures, or even how they would like sometimes, like for example, in the state I'm in India right now, there's this temple that's literally been cut into, like, so they cut into the rock to create that temple,
Mhm.
right? Or it's like another monolithic structure, but it's not where they constructed something. It's like almost as if they had this laser rock cutting technology where they could like precisely calculate what it's supposed to cut out on a computer, and then it
Mhm.
just like goes and then cuts like the exact shape of it. You know
Right.
what I mean? Because you can see how precise the geometry is of the carving,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
So it just serves a lot of these ancient sites just serve to me as more proof that these technologies existed, because a lot of these sites, when you try to replicate it with modern technology, you can't.
Hmm.
So a lot of these ancient sites can still not be built by our current technology. So I mean, it only makes sense that the people who built those in were in possession of a much more advanced technologies than we
Hmm.
have today.
Yeah. 100%, man.
Yeah,
That's what seems to be the truth.
yeah,
When you really look at it with an open mind, that's what seems to
exactly.
be the
But
most
then you could
plausible.
see how the rigid skeptical side could just like dismiss it all,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And I
Yeah,
was there. I remember having that same kind of attitude. It's just that, if someone came to me 15 years ago and mentioned the idea that, ancient people 30,000 years ago had far more advanced technology than us, I would be like, immediately my mind would say that's crazy. But then when
yeah,
I
same.
really analyze it, I thought, why do I think it's crazy? It's like the only reason I think it's crazy is because from when I was a kid, I was told
Yeah,
different. And the only
exactly.
reason it just conflicts with what I always believed,
Yeah,
but it doesn't conflict with what I think can be true. Like
yeah,
clearly it's possible that we've had more advanced civilizations back then. Clearly it's
yeah,
possible that we got to a certain point where we understood technology more than we do now, but then everything kind of collapsed because of some global calamity. Like that's not impossible. But the reason why I dismissed it entirely is because from when I was a kid, I was told different and I believed what I
mm,
was told. But when I just
yeah,
questioned my own belief, I was like, why do I think that? Well, I thought that because the
yeah,
schools told me. I was like, well, that doesn't necessarily make it true. So when you
yeah.
really just do a little bit of questioning, you can realize that the reason why you think the way you think is not necessarily because it's true. It's because it's just what you've been told and it's what you've always believed.
Exactly. It comes down to the idea of societal conditioning and indoctrination, right? How the modern education system and how curriculums are designed
Hmm.
are almost as if there's like an intent to create this rigid skeptical mind,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
um yeah. And but yeah, when it comes to the condition, I've also noticed that when it comes to thought process in general, I've noticed that by immersing yourself more in the other's shoes. So, for example, the concept of rigid skepticism comes from the person being unable to understand the thought process of the person that they're arguing.
Hmm.
So essentially, like for example, when we speak to people who we would consider too rigidly skeptical, we know that they're rigidly skeptical because we're able to understand their thought process because we once thought like that,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So the idea, so in the same way, they have to also, like the same way, the way we were able to come out of that rigid skepticism was was by agreeing within ourselves and saying, okay, wait, let's see the perspective of this person who's presenting us with this information that we currently find crazy, but we're still open-minded in the sense we're like, okay, let's try and understand why they think that way.
Hmm.
And
Exactly.
that's what triggered us to become more constructively
Mm.
skeptical and not rigidly skeptical.
Yeah. Hmm.
um, so in the same way, for someone to get out of rigid skepticism, all it takes is being able to try and understand all thought process, not just their own.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
100%, man.
yeah,
That's exactly how it came to be within me. I just tried to I stopped dismissing everybody. If
yeah,
somebody said the most outlandish thing, like, "Oh, I speak to dragons," or something nuts like that, I'd be
yeah,
like, "Tell me more." You know? Instead
yeah,
of being like, "This dude's
yeah,
a kook," I'd be like, "What do you
yeah,
mean you speak to
yeah,
dragons? Like, what are you
yeah,
talking about?" But I'd be interested, instead of just
yeah, yeah, for
outright
sure.
dismissing and just throwing it
Exactly.
away, saying this dude's nuts.
That is the scientific approach.
Yeah, exactly. You want to know more. You want to understand where they're coming from. And like you said, I
Exactly.
can understand the limitations of other people's minds now because I was in that mindset as well. And I can
Exactly.
see how they're limited because I was limited exactly like they were.
Exactly.
But yeah,
Yeah.
but I'm still learning all the time. I
Yeah.
still don't know
Same.
everything.
Same
It's just a
here.
constant
Yeah.
journey of knowing. I
That
don't
that's
know
actually what
anything.
that's actually what the whole idea of awakening is about. It's waking up to the fact that we don't know anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Because modern academia will have you believing that humans are the epitome and that we know it all,
Yeah.
but we don't.
Yeah, there's so
That's
much we
like
don't.
what rigid skepticism teaches, that we know it all.
Yeah. Just
Um,
trust the people who came before you. They wrote it down in books.
yeah,
Take their word for it.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You
So
like the scientific method is productive, but we have this blind faith in the scientists that they practiced it properly.
yeah,
Or like
exactly.
when we
It's the
doubt
thing is,
science,
yeah,
when we
yeah,
doubt science, we're not doubting the method. We're doubting the people who had biases when they practiced it.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why oftentimes when you can when it comes to dealing with someone who is rigidly skeptical,
Yeah.
oftentimes even when you're like overwhelmingly throwing scientific evidence, so evidence that does follow the scientific method at them,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they will still deny it without looking at it,
Yeah.
because essentially they're going about it in an unscientific way. Because if you don't even take the time to look at something, you're not studying it anymore, and that's unscientific. You're not observing it anymore, right? And
Yeah.
the whole idea of science is to be able to come up with a hypothesis based on an observation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's almost as if we've reached a point where what modern academia is calling science is at its core is unscientific.
I would
And that's
agree.
why, like, nowadays whenever I talk to people or I'm like chatting with people, oftentimes I have to put the word science in quotation marks,
Yeah.
so it's like so I can get that point across,
Yeah, exactly.
to
Yeah.
the point where it's like they're using the guise of science. It's
Mm.
almost as if they're using the word science as like a cloak.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the real science is actually the study of physics and metaphysics, for that matter,
Mm-hmm.
because metaphysics is going beyond visible forces. Right now we're
Right.
talking about um, basically, I've noticed that in with modern academia, when it comes to invisible forces, those are the ones that they just study less, because they feel that because it's invisible it makes it less observable, but that's
Mm-hmm.
not true.
Yeah.
So for example, the idea of electromagnetic energy, or even gravity, or what have you, the fact that it's invisible is enough to dissuade modern scientists from wanting to observe it
Mm-hmm.
further,
Mm-hmm.
because they feel that it's an unobservable object, but
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah. And to
Yeah,
imply that there are frequencies beyond what we can measure is somewhat like taboo in our
yeah,
society. Like we have this band of frequency, like you said, we're right in the middle with what we can see in the visible light spectrum, but then it
yeah.
goes so far in each direction
Beyond that,
beyond that, like gamma rays,
exactly,
X-rays, stuff like that. But
exactly.
then we just believe that it stops at the end, like where our
Yeah,
machines can, I don't know what's the polar end of the spectrum, but like for sake of an argument, say it's gamma rays. We have machines that can detect gamma rays, so but we don't have anything that can detect anything past gamma rays, so the scientific community just assumes there's no
that that's the
frequency past
end.
that. That's just
Yeah,
the end of
exactly.
frequency. But there are
Exactly. It could
frequencies.
even be an infinite spectrum
Yeah,
for all we know. You
that's
know.
the way it makes sense to me. It's just
Yeah,
infinity just exists
that's
and
what exactly.
goes forever bigger and up and goes forever
Yeah,
smaller and down.
yeah,
There's no
yeah.
end to it.
That's how I look at it.
Hmm. So I'm curious. I remember you talked about earlier the pyramids and how they were often topped with some sort of like quartz crystal or something like that. So, given what you've learned, if you were to make a hypothesis or a theory, what do you think they were actually used for?
So I personally resonate with the idea that these were actually like megalithic structures with the purpose of not only harnessing energy like from the ether, so like free energy. So not only were there pretty much mega Tesla towers,
Mm-hmm.
but they were also these sort of enlightenment ecosystems almost.
Mm.
Because when I was studying the Vedas, oftentimes people, like in modern day, they refer to these ancient sites as temples, as places of worship. But the
Mm-hmm.
more you look into it, you start realizing that this wasn't just a place of worship, right?
Mm-hmm.
There had to have been more going on at these archaeological sites, because you have basically enough space to fit a lot of people, first of all, right? um, and not only do you see that they were able to come visit, but you see living quarters, right? You see
Mm.
like that they were actually they were not only living quarters, but also like different areas of the property had different functions. So there was even like a water generating system. There was
Mm-hmm.
even like a food production system. There was like, basically it was almost as if it was like what I find it very interesting to what me and my friend are building now, because we started building this project, and then now when we're doing the research on free energy and stuff, and then we start studying the Vedas, and then we come across the idea of enlightenment ecosystems, and then when they describe these ecosystems, it's pretty much like what we want to build,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's like, it's almost as if these temples were actually the central hubs of where earth was being rebuilding after the last dark age.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes
But then
sense.
eventually got infiltrated and corrupt, and then
Mm-hmm.
it leads us to the dark world we are in now. But then right now we're reversing again. So that's why you're seeing people like me and many around the world who are focusing on building projects like this, like basically projects that focus on self-sustainability, eco-friendliness, like more sustainable farming, basically trying to close the loop, right? Have zero waste,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
to the point where you're you're not only taking, but you're giving back. So it's like a closed loop.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
Yeah.
the
Exactly.
current system is just taking, like
Mm-hmm.
consuming, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because like that you said that it's more than just an energy generator, but also like has to do with the level of consciousness as well. Because I've often heard people's accounts of going to visit the pyramids, and even though it's not in the same exact structure it was, however many years ago it was constructed, people still have this sense of a raising of energy or consciousness
Yeah,
when they are in its presence, like just standing near it.
yeah,
People have reported like psychedelic type experiences just from being in
yes,
the presence of it.
yeah,
So there's something there that is raising the consciousness of the people
yes,
that is in
yeah.
its proximity to.
So, so yeah, that's actually a really interesting point you brought up, and I think it just serves to show that these sites were chosen deliberately. So, for
Hmm.
example, when you look at a lot of the sites of the ancient Hindu temples or the Vedic temples, and then you look at where the pyramids were built, or even things like when you go up to Europe and you see Stonehenge, for example, people have reported having psychedelic experiences just being near those rocks, the
Hmm.
Stonehenge rocks as well. So, so it's almost as if these there all over the world there are certain points that radiate more, that can serve as central hubs, so basically where a lot of streams of energy are meeting, right?
Hmm.
So
Yep.
they sort of, so think about it as like same like the internet where you have nodes, right?
Hmm.
And then the nodes act as um, like these central points that basically when you look at all of it you see it like as one giant web,
Yeah.
right? In the
Yep.
same way you have these points geographically all over the planet, and essentially you can not only generate energy from one of those points, but you can even relay energy from one point to another wirelessly.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
kind of where the idea of wireless energy transfer comes into place. It's like
Hmm.
wireless emission of electricity.
Right.
um, it's so, and then oftentimes these these points are directly correlated to our cosmology. So when you start studying the star systems, right, and how the pyramids were built to align with the Orion's belt, and how the three pyramids are aligned with the three stars that make up the Orion's belt.
Yeah.
And also, I find it very interesting when you start studying cosmology and astronomy. I find it interesting how we have the Polaris star, right? So there's the Polaris star, the North Star, the stationary star,
Right.
and it's like it's still hard for me to comprehend the Polaris star. So, for example, I don't see how they could be a stationary star unless we are like, I don't know. That's where I'm like
you said, it's not actually stationary. It's just relative to us.
Yeah, relative to us, exactly. Yeah,
It's still
relative to us is
moving around the.
Yeah, of course. The idea is that it's still moving, but I'm saying it's hard to fathom that it keeps moving when to us when we see that all the stars move, or like basically they say that it's because of the rotation of the Earth. That's why we see like the Milky Way and all. And based on my observations from like observing the moon, and like I'm an astrophotographer as well, right? So I love to take photos of the Milky Way, and it's just something I always thought of. I was like, it's still quite hard for me to point to like pinpoint why we have the North Star, right? And it's also correlated to the North Pole.
Yeah.
So yeah, and also I feel like sorry.
I kind of see it the way like you mentioned how we always are seeing the same face of the moon. It's kind of like we're tethered to it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I would think of it the same way with the North Star. There's like it's not like an actual physical tether. It's just that.
But there has to be a connection there.
Yeah,
right? There has to be some sort of connection.
It's just that like our movement, the movement of the Earth, just happens to line up with the movement of that star in the galaxy. So right now we're moving together. Maybe over a couple million or billion years, we'll start to go at a phase with one another. But as of right now, we're so in sync with each other that for this period of time, that star will almost always be precisely aligned with our northern.
Always be percent. Yeah.
But yeah, it's just just an alignment that occurs for a certain amount of time. At some point, we'll probably slowly drift away from each other, and that might not be our most northern point anymore.
Yeah, I honestly think that from studying the Vedic, or like for example, just ancient scriptures, and studying ancient cosmology and astronomy, and I think we'll further be able to answer questions like this. So for example, from determining why they chose those points, because now we can see that they chose those energy points based on the stars, right? So there could be some sort of correlation there where maybe right now we're not able to explain yet, but soon enough, if we keep studying this, and if we keep observing this, we'll be able to eventually explain it.
I couldn't agree more, man.
Yeah.
Everything's going to come to the light. We're in the movement into the golden age, my friend.
Yeah, man. That's what's happening, dude. I can feel it.
Me too, man.
Definitely.
More and more every day. It's pretty intense.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I'm glad we're on this earth at this time.
Yeah, it's like, it feels like what a time to be alive, right?
Yeah.
You feel that sense.
Sure. Yeah. Well, man, I think that's a good way to wind it down. I was wondering if you have anything that you want to plug. Like, do you want to talk about the project you're doing? Like, is there anything that you want to advertise? Like, do you have like, a website or anything like that you'd like to steer people towards? Anything that you want to advertise in any way?
Well, the thing is, we don't have a website or anything yet. So we don't have any digital resources or content made for the project yet. But I can just sort of give a little brief on what it's going to look like.
Sure.
We've only just begun construction. Actually, with the advent of the coronavirus hysteria, it's put a hold on a lot of our construction work.
Yeah.
But so the idea is that the timeline of the project is for it to be ready within the next like 18 to 24 months.
Okay.
But basically, it's going to be you could describe it as an eco-sustainable resort.
Okay.
that uses a permaculture and food forestry model for food production, and also like management of waste, because when you have a permaculture system, you can even manage waste to the point where you're recycling the waste so that it's being absorbed by the soil and then it's producing more food, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that it's going to be a resort where not only people can come, like casual nightly stay travelers can come, but we're even going to be holding retreats there. So it's basically going to be like a fully outfitted property, to the point where we'll have these like boutique bungalows and villas, but they're going to feel as if they're part of the jungle, because they're going to be
Mm.
surrounded by canopy and trees.
Mm.
And but every tree and plant is going to be a fruit or a medicinal herb or a spice or a nut tree or a, you know what I mean? So like every single plant around you is going to be some food. If
Oh
it's
man.
edible, it's going to, yeah. So so
So
in
you're
addition
designing
to,
paradise.
yeah, oftentimes like when I'm describing it, I feel like I'm building it, like I'm describing like a heaven on earth,
Oh
you
man.
know?
100%,
So
man.
so but yeah, in addition to the bungalows, there's also going to be different facilities. So for example, we're planning to build, basically we're using our architecture designs are all based off of hempcrete, a combination of hempcrete. Have you heard of hempcrete
Mhm.
before?
Mhm.
So it's a combination of hempcrete, bamboo architecture, and earth bricks, right? Um, so we're planning it to be as eco-friendly as possible. And the reason why we're using hempcrete as well is because hempcrete is actually an amazing and much more efficient form of concrete,
Mm.
because you actually have insulation built into the brick, so
Right.
you no longer have to pad roofs with insulation, with chemical insulation, right?
Right.
So it's pretty awesome that it completely removes the need for any extra insulation, which is
Right.
awesome.
I
um,
could be wrong, but when I was researching the energy in general, I found somebody said something about certain building materials that actually absorb CO2, and I think they said that hempcrete might be one of them.
yeah, yeah, it is, yeah,
That's incredible because, like,
yeah,
like they were talking about how, like, to combat our surplus of CO2 in the atmosphere, and one of
yeah,
those ways is to make buildings absorb it. And if we build
yeah,
all of our buildings that have hempcrete and similar materials, we could literally draw CO2 from the air.
exactly, yeah,
Mhm.
that's precisely right. um, but yeah, so in addition to the rooms, right, there's also going to be different facilities. So for example, we're even planning to build like this rad observatory on the property,
Mm.
so that at night like guests can observe the stars. But then underneath the top deck of the observatory, there'll be like a warm, like cozy library, like full of esoteric books,
Mm.
where people can just come and learn. um, and then
Oh,
there's also going to
man.
be a yoga hall. So in the yoga hall is where we'll be teaching things like yoga, meditation, and maybe even we're thinking about having like a metaphysics class as well,
Mm.
um, which I think could be interesting. And then there'll be a fitness facility on site, so you'll be able to practice like things like calisthenic movement, like functional training, actually even martial arts, because we're going to be teaching Muay Thai as well, because Muay Thai is like the national martial art
Mhm.
of Thailand.
Right.
um, I mean, eventually we could even have a guest Shaolin teaching kung fu for like a couple of weeks,
Right.
you know what
Oh,
I
man.
mean?
Yeah.
so
It's a
so
beautiful
and
vision, man.
yeah, it's, I mean, when I think of it, it's like I don't see how I'd ever want to leave there,
I
you know.
know. I might come to India,
um,
man, or Thailand. You got it in
yeah,
Thailand?
Thailand. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's in Thailand. So there'll even be like a spa where there'll be like a sauna. And then we're actually planning to have ice plunge as well, so that people can practice Wim Hof techniques. So
Mm.
maybe you've heard of Wim Hof
Oh,
before.
yeah.
um, yeah, so we'll have an ice plunge on site, and then also like an organic cafe, where that's where we're serving food to our guests, right? So that's like the dining area.
Mhm.
um, and maybe also, oh yeah, something I forgot to mention was also like a medicinal herb garden. So there'll be a
Mm.
small garden dedicated to growing medicinal herbs, and then maybe even a little alchemy lab where we're creating natural medicine, because we are seeing how uh, pr- particularly plants like cannabis that actually can have the ability to cure cancer. Like we
Mm-hmm.
have the ability to cure cancer,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually our motivation in wanting to produce plant medicine, is
Mm-hmm.
so that people can realize that they don't have to rely on synthetic chemicals that end up not working anyway,
Mm-hmm.
um, when they can actually cure the root of their problems in
Yep.
nature. So in the alchemy lab will be sort of where we're creating plant medicine, but also like soaps, shampoos, cosmetics for the resort, right? So we're
Right.
sustaining ourselves. We're like producing stuff that we need to keep stocking the rooms with by
Right.
ourselves as well. And then essentially each of these facilities, oh, we're planning to have an archery shooting range as well.
Cool.
Yeah. Um, so so yeah, essentially all of these facilities can be used as classrooms as well. So for example, in the yoga hall we can teach metaphysics, or in the astronomy, in the observatory we can teach astronomy and astrology, cosmology.
Mm-hmm.
In the fitness facility we can teach martial arts. In the alchemy lab we can even, I mean, the possibilities are endless. In an alchemy
Really.
lab you can teach biochemistry.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So um, and then on top of that, we're also going to have a creative arts lab. So because both me and my business partner were both creatives, as in, the thing is, all humans are creators, right?
Mm.
So we're essentially, remember how I said that we have been bestowed with the gift of creation? Like
Mm-hmm.
humans have the gift of creation. So
Yeah.
our inherent nature is that we're creators.
Right.
So my background and my business partner's background are actually that we're both photographers. I do, basically both of us do a lot of underwater photography as well, because both of
Mm.
us have backgrounds in scuba diving, free diving. As in, I'm a scuba diving instructor, he's a free diving instructor. Um, and we both do a lot of photography and video. We actually run a media production company together as well. Um, so so basically it's going to be this creative arts lab where you can practice any art. So there's going to be, including music, so we're
Mm-hmm.
going to have both Indian and classical instruments for you to be able to play, learn. We're going to have, like, if you want to do painting you can paint. If you want to do pottery, we're going to have pottery, because for example you could teach people how to make like miniature pots, and then teach them how to grow food, and then they can take home their seedlings in like their little miniature pots that they made, right? So I think it just all these things just can just keep adding to the experience. So, and on top of that, we'll be even teaching people photography and stuff. So we'll be taking people on tours, because it's actually, it's on a riverbed that connects to a lake. And when you're at the lake, it literally looks like, have you seen the movie Avatar?
Yes.
So it looks like the planet in Avatar, like the
Wow.
paradise planet. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty awesome. It's pretty rad. So we'll be taking people on tours, on hikes, and on like uh, kayak tours. We're actually already working on a conservation project for the park to turn all the diesel boats to electric. But then we're
Mm.
also implementing electric kayaks so that it's much quieter, because these really loud boats scare the elephants and the monkeys away.
Mm.
So if you're using like an electric boat or an electric kayak, your safari experience is also much more enhanced, because you're not scaring the animals away anymore. So you're seeing like
Mhm.
tons of monkeys and elephants coming out, and like it's paradise.
Man.
So so we'll teach photography, and then not only will we teach them photography, but for example, we'll be able to come back to the creative arts lab and then teach them how to edit photos and
Right.
like edit videos, and like it'll just be this, you quote unquote enlightenment ecosystem,
Oh,
right?
dude.
Yeah.
That sounds amazing,
So
man.
yeah,
You like,
yeah.
if I were to imagine something like that, like I've done a lot of imagining things about how like you could have like just like when I imagine the new world in general. Like that's the
Yeah.
kind of thing I see there. Everything you
Yeah.
described is exactly in line with how I would design it as well.
Yeah.
It's beautiful,
Basically,
man.
we're letting our imaginations run wild because we're
Hmm.
seeking. The thing is, we're almost fully in terms of seeking investment. We've found investors not only internally, like within our family, but even externally.
Hmm.
Um, and but the thing is, the reason why we were able to design it so well was because even before we came up with the funds, we were like, we're doing this. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
We were like, yeah, this is happening. We're doing it no matter what. We're gonna get the money no matter how we get it. It doesn't matter. We're gonna get it done.
Right.
So being in that mindset while designing it was what allowed us to let our imaginations run wild. And then we
Yeah.
were like, yeah, we'll even throw this in there. We'll even throw that in there. We'll
Yes.
throw it all in there. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Not
And
limited by
then
money.
exactly. And
Hmm.
that's kind of how I started comprehending the whole idea of, because oftentimes I'd see how these coaches and self-development coaches would often say, oh, you have to switch from a mindset of scarcity to that of an abundance mindset. But it
Hmm.
was something that I was like, oh yeah, I get it, but I didn't fully understand it until like us going into that abundance mindset and being like, okay, we're gonna build this project no matter how we get the money, it doesn't
Yeah.
matter, we're gonna get it done.
Right.
And and switching to that mindset not only created a better design, but it also is what attracted the funds.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
so
Exactly.
so already believing that you're in possession of the funds is what attracts the funds,
Yes. Exactly.
because
Yeah.
you're pitching it in that way as well, right? So
Hmm.
you're pitching it to the investor in a way where it's like to them they're like, oh, this guy's pitching me a no-brainer idea,
Hmm.
like an
Hmm.
idea that I can't not invest
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because when you're limited by the idea of money, your ideas won't go as far.
in.
And then when you
Exactly.
bring it to an investor, they're gonna be like, "Yeah, this has been done before." But in order
Yeah.
to do something that's never been done before, you got to have the imagination that you can go beyond those limits.
Yeah, exactly. And also it's important to start looking at money as more of a means to an end rather than the end goal itself.
Exactly. Exactly, man.
So yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And one of these days, we won't even need it anymore because
Exactly.
projects
We're
like
gonna
your
be
own
like
will be all over the world.
fully abundant and like self-sustaining. Yeah.
Exactly, man. You
Yeah.
use money as an energy exchange currently to create the new world where it's no longer necessary.
Exactly. Where the new world where the energy exchange is actual energy being exchanged and
Mm,
not economic energy.
yes,
You
exactly. Yeah,
know what I mean? So at that
100%.
point, we're already harnessing this, like whatever we're trying to understand
Hmm.
when it comes to like prana or chi or what have you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful, man. That's a beautiful
Yeah.
idea.
But yeah, man, you're always welcome to come visit whenever.
Dude, I might have to come work for you.
I mean, even if you come, the thing is, we're also planning to have like a really nicely designed dorm space as well.
Hmm.
So it'll be a dorm room, but then there'll also be a nice living room area and a nice kitchen for the dorm,
Hmm.
the people who are staying in the dorm. Basically, the idea is that we're also going to let volunteers come, stay for free, and eat for free.
Mm,
And in exchange, they'll help out, right?
yeah.
So and we're gonna make sure that even the volunteers feel like they're sleeping in like the most comfortable, like, you
Hmm.
know what I mean? Because oftentimes in my experience, at least doing volunteer work and like workaways or staying at hostels, oftentimes it would be very like not I wouldn't say unsatisfying, but I'd say very basic, right? So
Right. Yeah, exactly.
like very basic amenities, whereas I want my volunteers to feel that where they feel like they won't want to leave,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
So it's gonna just feel such like so cozy.
Yes, man.
um
Exactly.
so 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 yeah, the idea is for volunteers to come for free, but I'm saying like even if you were to come in the next year, for example, while we're building, I
Hmm.
mean, we'll have a place for you to crash, or
Hmm.
so it's like whenever you decide to visit Thailand, just know that you have like a free place to stay.
Wonderful, man. That's
Yeah.
beautiful, dude.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Holy shit, man. That's amazing. I'm
Yeah.
so glad you're doing that. Like I've imagined things like, that's always been my idea. Like one of the ideas I had over the past 5 to 7 years is just like creating like a healing center. So what I mean,
Yeah.
my way of healing, like the way I help people is that I just speak to them because I I looked deep within my own mind and found out exactly what was keeping me down and keeping me from
Yeah.
truly growing. So I have a really, I guess, a lot of experience just speaking about emotions and understanding them,
Yeah.
and just truths in general, like that discernment is, I find, really strong within me. But then I
Yeah.
have so many friends who are so talented. Like I have a friend who's studying Chinese medicine now, and before that, before she even went to school for Chinese medicine, she was a massage therapist, and she was trained in reflexology, and I think she did a little bit of Reiki as well. So she's
Okay.
learning all kinds of different things. I have another friend who knows a lot about Ayurvedic medicine, and she's also a nutritionist. And then there's another friend that recently learned something called the emotion code. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's essentially like, the idea that we trapped emotions in our bodies can lead to illness. So she has a technique of releasing those emotions. So there's like there's so many people in my group of friends that would be excellent in a healing setting. So I thought about like just creating a healing center where you could come and you can take advantage of all the separate types of skills we offer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
That's essentially pretty much what we're trying to do as well. So,
mhm,
so at the end of the day, the goal is actually the goal is awakening, right? So waking up.
of
Anyone
course.
who visits there will have this sort of experience which will change their perspective on life, right? So
Yeah,
they will. It'll be, in my opinion, awakening and healing are like one of the same. You know what I
exactly.
mean? So
Yeah.
it's like interchangeable to the
Hmm.
point where we will also want to offer things like acupressure, acupuncture,
Hmm.
massage therapy, basically going back to ancient forms of healing and
Hmm.
therapy, right?
Hmm.
um, so yeah, man, that's awesome. And also I find it interesting that you mentioned that um, that like one of the ways you've been able to help people is by speaking to them about emotions, and like that's oftentimes how you can heal someone. And I bet that's also made you realize how powerful words can be, right?
Mm. Hmm.
So, or just in general, how powerful communication can be. So,
Hmm.
so for example, how we can, even though we're like communicating now and understanding each other now, there's still more efficient modes of communication. So for example, being able to describe something with the use of less words,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
so that it reaches a point where you can like wake someone up just by uttering like one sentence,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah,
So yeah, so that's
exactly.
kind of like that's kind of the idea.
Yeah,
And
and
then
there's
that's
so
what I
much.
meant by, yeah, sorry, what?
Like even just the idea of communication you're talking about, like how it doesn't necessarily have to be words. Like just for an example, when I'm sitting with someone and they're working through their own emotions, and like maybe discussing something, some trauma they experienced, my communication won't be words. It
It'll
is
be
my
like
presence.
reading, right?
Like I'm
Or
here,
okay, yeah,
I'm an open space for you to say
yeah,
whatever you need without judgment.
yeah, yeah.
By me being there and not contorting my
You're
face every
providing
time they
that
say
energy.
something,
Yeah,
I'm saying, I'm here and I'm not going to judge you. That allows
yeah,
them to open up and move through their
yeah,
own stuff
yeah,
without even me
yeah,
saying a word.
yeah. And
There's
then
still communication.
oftentimes, yeah, and then oftentimes it is communication, because
Mhm.
oftentimes you're also reading certain things off of them. So
Exactly.
it doesn't necessarily have to be something they're saying,
Hmm.
but you can still, it's like what people refer to as reading someone else. Is at the end of the day, you're picking up on a communicative signal,
Yeah.
right? That's what you're doing.
Hmm.
So and that's what I feel that we're heading towards. Is like, for example, if we start heading back towards the ancients languages, right, where you have like one Sanskrit word that can mean 30 phrases in English, right?
Hmm.
um, but then when you go even beyond that and see how eventually you reach a point where you're not even using words anymore, where you're literally like you're reading the person without words, right? And that
Hmm.
could be even be described as like telepathy. So for
Hmm.
example, this it goes hand in hand with us embracing unity consciousness, right? So the more we come together and more we start behaving and acting like one organism, it only makes sense that we'd be able to communicate them telepathically,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So because no longer would there be like, basically, since we're flushing out the parasites, it's like we're we're making the energy to sustain these parasites scarce, right?
Hmm.
We're rendering that specific energy scarce.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what drives off the parasites, is because they can no longer survive in this environment.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, we're removing, even in terms of communication, we're removing a person's ability to have a hidden agenda, because if they do have a hidden agenda, with your psychic ability, you'd be able to see right through the
Right.
agenda, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, and that's kind of where clairvoyance comes into place, because clairvoyance is actually, I see clairvoyance before telepathy. So it's like you probably start experiencing more things that you could describe more as clairvoyance than telepathic. So where, for example, you can tell where someone is lying to you instantly just from talking to them, or
Mm-hmm.
if you're picking up on certain muscle twitches on their face that
Mm-hmm.
are indicators of certain things. Like basically that comes down to our cognition. So it comes down to, like, you know, the guy in the movie Limitless,
Yeah. Yeah.
where he like starts having microscopic vision, where he can like see something from so far away, but it's as if he's looking at it
Yeah.
dead on, or where he can just read a whole book in like 10 minutes and like fully absorb it all, or like watch a video on martial arts, and then all of a sudden he knows kung fu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um, so it's almost as if it's like that's ultimately what we're doing when we're awakening or trying to expand our consciousness, is we're improving our cognition, we're improving our cognitive abilities. So it only makes sense that eventually we will reach a point where we are experiencing those abilities. I mean, if you've done any sort of, if you've had any sort of psychedelic experiences before, you would probably know that it almost feels as if you're awakening certain abilities, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you're basically enhancing your ability of metaphysical sight.
Mm-hmm.
um so especially when it comes to like things like LSD, for
Mm-hmm.
example, I've noticed that um it's almost as if you there have been times where it's like someone who's like 2 kilometers away down the beach,
Mm-hmm.
but while you're like on your spirit, on your like psychedelic journey, right, it's almost as if you're like looking at him like directly in the face, as in it's like you can tell it's because you're able to see the features so clearly even though you're that far away,
Mm-hmm.
that it
Mm-hmm.
feels as though you're like looking at it from a closer
Right.
distance.
Because the light is still coming to you. You're still
Exactly.
getting all the information.
You're just like honing in more on
Yeah.
the light rays,
Exactly.
those
Yeah.
specific light rays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
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 Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
It's crazy the boundaries that are abolished in a psychedelic experience.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
much so much more can be seen and
It's
understood and felt
yeah.
and heard. And yeah.
We're just perceiving more of reality, but
Exactly. Yeah.
we're at the same time we're thinking that it's just we're thinking that it's just this external chemical that's caused. Well, of course, it's the combination, right? It's the
Mm.
combination of the chemical reaction it causes in the brain for
Mhm.
us to be able to perceive more.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so in essence, you could sort of see expanding your awareness or raising your consciousness as the ability to release more of these compounds in our brain, because at the end
Mm-hmm.
of the day, all of these are natural endogenous compounds that our
Yeah.
body produces.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's ultimately it's us being able to tap into that and like releasing it more. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean?
Well, like even with LSD is just so similar in its makeup to the neurotransmitter serotonin.
Exactly.
And so it just kind of binds to the same receptors. But
Exactly.
you produce your own serotonin. And
Exactly.
if you practice things that kind of elevate your consciousness, you won't even need LSD to get to that higher state of consciousness.
That's why you have things like where you see how meditation increases serotonin
Exactly.
levels,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, or for example, even have you heard of the compound anandamide
I don't think so.
before?
Mm-mm.
Basically, they call it the bliss molecule,
Mm.
and it's actually they named it after the word ananda, which comes from Sanskrit, which means
Mm.
bliss.
I've always
Ananda is the
heard
Sanskrit
Sat Chit
word for
Ananda.
bliss.
What's Sat Chit
Yeah.
Ananda? What's that mean?
I'm not sure actually what Sachit
I've heard
means.
like when you say
I
Ananda,
know
that's what comes to my head.
I know people with the name Sachit. I know it's a name.
Ah, okay.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and even Anand or Ananda is a name.
Mm-hmm.
But so basically, after they discovered this endogenous compound, they named it anandamide because it was they say it's the chemical compound in our brain that's responsible for bliss, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the receptors that receive our this bliss molecule are actually the receptors of our endocannabinoid system. We named it endocannabinoid system because we thought that it's the basically we named them, for example, we named them CB1 receptors, CB2 receptors,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So and we named them CB receptors because we were naming them after the endocannabinoid system. And
Right.
basically it's the system in our body, like we most people know respiratory system, they know circulatory system, they know like basically all the systems, but then when you mention endocannabinoid system, it's one bodily system that not many are familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
but it's actually one of the most important because it's the system in our body that is in charge of maintaining homeostasis,
Right.
right?
Yep.
So maintaining a state of equilibrium, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we consume um, cannabinoids like THC or CBD,
Mm-hmm.
it's actually the receptor, it's actually our anandamide receptors that are receiving the THC and CBD because
Mm.
because the compound anatomical makeup, as in the shape of the atom, right, or the
The molecule.
the molecule
Mm-hmm.
is very similar in shape to THC and CBD, and that's why we can get those effects from cannabis and those like blissful homeostasis kind of effects, to the
Mm-hmm.
point where it's even resulting in the healing of cancer. Because think about it, it's the cannabis creating homeostasis which results in you curing your own cancer,
Yes.
right?
Exactly. Yep.
And that's why cannabis is so effective, is because it's working with our it's actually working with our anandamide receptors.
I see.
And we have these receptors all over our body, so it's not only in our brains, we have CB receptors in every organ, in every like all over our bodies.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that we have more cannabinoid receptors than any other receptor.
Yeah, probably. I mean,
Mhm.
that makes total sense. I mean, think about it. If it's the receptor and corresponding molecule that's in charge of maintaining a state of balance,
Yeah,
right? So it's
exactly.
like, what does that mean? It's like it's probably the most important system, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yep.
So, um, and if you think about it, that's kind of what the spiritual awakening and like expanding your consciousness is all about. Is you can't often hear the idea of balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah,
balance within everything. So
exactly.
I feel like it goes two and two together.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
100%.
yeah. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Man, we could do a whole other episode on that alone, I think.
Yeah, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
All right. Well, I'm gonna bring this to an end now. Any final words you want to end with? Like even that production company you were talking about that you have for your photography. Is
Oh
there
yeah,
anything you want to point anybody to that?
so we're right now we're with Aqua Media. That's our company.
Okay.
We're based out of Phuket in Thailand,
Mm-hmm.
and the project we're building is going to be called the Ark, right? So
Very
um,
appropriate.
yeah, and that's actually located like a 2-hour drive north of Phuket. So it's
Okay.
actually in this national park that's a remnant of a rainforest that's supposedly older than the Amazon. So the
Mm.
biodiversity is very strong in there, and it's quite pretty well preserved. Basically, you have these huge 1,000-foot rock cliffs that shoot up out of nowhere. So they shoot up out of 0 to 1,000, like all of a sudden, and it's like this whole range of them, and then you have a lake in the middle.
Wow.
So yeah,
Okay.
it's pretty awesome. Yeah, it's called Khao Sok National Park. So that's where we're building the
Very
project.
cool. Awesome, man.
Yeah, yeah,
All right. Well, that was absolutely incredible, man. That
yeah,
was such an amazing conversation.
yeah, man. I
I
mean,
learned so much.
you contributed to it as much as I did.
It was
So it's
beautiful,
like
dude.
kudos to both of us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on,
Yeah,
man. That
yeah.
was
Thank
truly
you for
incredible.
having me, man. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for having me.